Oh yeah, we got to overturn.
You're listening to the E-Men, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. You know, I often tell the story that the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit started because of Paul Perricone. It's his fault. I often joke because, as I've told the story before, and you guys have heard it in the audience, Paul, of course, great guy, good friend of mine out of Truck One and later on the Bomb Squad, happened to mention John Lampkin. And I did a project in the 7th grade on, 9/11, the events of that day. And one of the stories I pulled was one that John Lampkin had wrote. And the reason why I mentioned Sergeant Lampkin tonight is he just retired from the private sector. Of course, he's long retired from the NYPD, but he retired again, and now he's retired. So Sergeant Lampkin, a special shout out to you, and thanks for all you've done over the years, from, of course, being in the NYPD, working in Truck 2, working in Truck 1 as an officer, sergeant in Truck 1 as well, to what you've done in the private sector on the security side. If there's anybody who has earned their retirement and now can really just rest and chill out and do absolutely nothing, kick their feet up, relax, it is you, sir. So shout out to you. And of course, this mini-series started because of you, because you were the first guest for it. Hopefully I can get Sergeant Lampkin back on for another story sometime down the road. Welcome, though. It's episode 306. Last week was going to be 306, but Buster only. I don't know what happened there. We'll have to reschedule. Of course, the baseball reporter for ESPN. You never know sometimes. These people confirm, and then it just fell through. So hopefully we'll get him on sometime down the road, and that can actually happen. In the meantime, though, it's just a producer's corner with myself and producer Vick, which was fun. We talked baseball and other stuff for about an hour or so. So check that out if you haven't. And of course, for all you tuning in tonight, good to see you. If you have a question, fire it in the super chat if you're watching through YouTube. And hello to everybody watching on Twitter, of course, and LinkedIn to match. A couple of sponsors. One, not really a sponsor, but again, you got to advocate for yourselves. And it's my consulting company, MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. And I have a website now, just built. It's www.mcmediaeditingservicesllc.com. Simple to remember, at least I hope. And if you're looking for more information, you can check that out as I try to get off the ground with that. And if you need a lawyer, and I hope you never do, but if you do, go the route of my friend Joe Murray. And hi to Joe Maliga in the chat. And like I said, everybody else that's tuning in tonight. All right, now to my next guest. Well, from the fireground as a volunteer fireman, the back of an ambulance as an EMT, the New York City subways as a New York City transit cop, and lastly, the New York City streets as first a patrol cop and then an emergency service cop. My next guest certainly had quite the ride, as he'll tell me about tonight. It'd be in December of 1983 that he'd spend 4 years in the streets of the Bronx, split between both the Bronx Task Force and the 4-6 precinct. And then in 1987, he entered Eland. Over the next 19 years, he'd worked primarily in the Bronx Truck 4. Of course, he flew around to other trucks, but his main assignment was 4 Truck over in the Bronx when they opened it back up in late 1987. And that for this volume 43 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, Mr. Tony Johnson. Tony, welcome. How are you?
Good, Mike. How you doing?
Good to have you. And like I said, good to see all you in the chat. I know some of your old colleagues will be in there throughout the night. I'm expecting Stephanakis any moment now. Latanzio's already in there.
Good,
it's good
good.
to see
Hey,
you too, John. Truck 5 guy, Truck 3 guy. So before we get into anything involving your career, and it's an extensive one, where did it begin for you? Where'd you grow up?
That's an interesting story. I'm going to tell you a story that I kind of chuckle about it. When you grow up, a lot of people, you're born. I've heard even from some of the guys we spoke to, they tell you they're born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn. I was born in Manhattan in Harlem Hospital. And of course, I would know this because I was a baby, but my family hails from the South, from South Carolina. So I didn't know this because my first childhood memories, I'm guessing I was probably 4 or 5. And they weren't of New York because apparently after I was born, my mother took me to South Carolina to her mother. And that's where I spent the first few years of my life. My grandmother had a farm, an actual farm, and I look back on it as an adult and I'm like, Jesus Christ, it's almost like I was living in the 1800s because she had a farmhouse. She had a horse. She had, if you ever watched the old Western movies where you see someone plowing the field with the plow, that's the plow she had because she couldn't afford a tractor. We had a cow that provided milk. I remember her milking the cow. My uncle, I attempted to. I was too little. She had chickens in a coop. I remember that's where eggs came from for breakfast. And this house had no running water. The water came. I see the look on your face. That's when I thought about this as an adult. I was like, my God, I've told my kids this, and they look at me like, what? But the house had no running water. The water came from a pump outside the house. So, you had to go out and hand pump water. And I remember as a little kid filling a bucket up. That's where you went to get water to cook. That's where you went to get water to drink, to wash with. I bathed as a kid in an old tub. And because this house had no running water, the bathroom was an outhouse, believe it or not. And I say this because I laugh about it now. People, my friends that know me well, I despise this outhouse. I remember it well. You would not expect a kid so young. I remember having to go to this outhouse, and I was like, oh, my God. So anyway, that's where I grew up until I was either 5 or 6. And, I laugh at people who give these big elaborate birthday parties for 1-year-olds and 2. And I always laugh and I'm like, this kid's not going to remember this,
Exactly.
Kids don't remember this. I went through this with my daughter-in-law. I have 2 grandsons, Dominic and Roman, and their parents have given them some birthday parties. And I was like, this kid's not going to remember this. I could not obviously tell you what the first 3 years of my life. I think my earliest memories were about, I guess I was either 4 or 5. I'll tell you 4 quick little things that happened to me down there that I remember them like they were yesterday. Now, like I said, my grandmother had a working farm. She used to grow white potatoes and sweet peas, I remember. And she'd be out in the fields working all day. So what do you do with a 4 or 5-year-old? I was running around the yard. This was a pretty extensive piece of property. And on one of the occasions, I remember it was a hot day. And I tell you, I remember this like it was yesterday. And I'm sitting there. She gave me lunch, and I'm eating watermelon. I have on a T-shirt. I've got watermelon juice dripping all over me. And I'm sitting on an old car that my uncle had in the front yard. And I didn't know, again, being so young, there was a bee's nest in the grill. I disturbed the bees, and they came out and stung the crap out of me. I laughed. I learned early I wasn't allergic to bee stings. So if I had to guess, I'd guess I was stung a couple dozen times.
Yeesh.
I remember my grandmother seeing me running, and she realized it. And because where we were, the other thing about, like I said, where this house was, there was no phone. So there was no hospital. If your kid got stung by 10 bees today, you take him to the hospital. From my grandmother's house to get into the city to go to the hospital, if you were lucky, was an hour ride. So that's how rural I was where I lived. So my grandmother did, I guess, what old-fashioned grandmothers do. She made some kind of paste up, pulled out some stingers. And, I remember my arms being swollen up for, the rest of the day. And, that was that. Another memory I have from down there, and it's probably the first memory I think about where, could have had a serious effect on your life. And one day I'm in that same yard playing. My grandmother's working. And if I had to guess, I would guess she was probably about 50 yards away from me, which is half a football field. Like as an adult, I can remember the distance. And I'm just playing around in the yard, minding my own business. And all of a sudden, my grandmother picks up a hoe, the gardening tool, and starts running towards me. And she's yelling, "Look out." And I'm looking at her like, and I realize I'm probably 5 years. I'm looking at her like, "Look out for what?" And she's just yelling, "Look out." Now I'm in a big yard. The only thing in the yard is grass, a tree, and that car. I have no idea what she's talking about. As she's getting closer and she's running, and I didn't realize then, but my grandmother was, my God, she was probably 64, 65 years old. And she's running towards me. And as she gets maybe 20 feet away, she finally says, "Look out for that snake." Now, when she says, "Look out for that snake," now I'm this little kid. And I think about this in terms of my grandkids. Like I have a 4-year-old grandson at the moment. I can't imagine what he would do in the circumstances. Now I'm looking, I see no snake. I don't see it. Anyway, when she gets about 10 feet away from me, she gives this thing a whack. That's when I saw the snake. She cut it in half. Then she proceeded to chop it up, checked to see if I was bitten, made sure I wasn't bitten. And I was fine. I went on my way. I didn't discover until years later that the snakes that were common down there, what this was a water moccasin, which water moccasins are one of the most venomous snakes around. And they were common down there. I didn't know this. I was a little kid. And I don't know if the bite would have killed me, but when you get bit by a water moccasin today as an adult, you're taken to a venom center. You're given venom. You should survive it. I don't know what that bite from a water moccasin would do to a child. And their venom, unlike some venoms that cause you to bleed, their venom attacks tissue, goes after tissue. So that's where I developed my healthy dislike of snakes, and I've never liked them since. The last memory I have down there, which actually isn't a good one, but it was a catalyst in my life, is my grandmother, when she used to work out in the fields, what she would do is she would come in at the end of the day and sit on her front porch. And, I'd take her shoes off. She smoked a pipe. I just remember it was a sweet smelling tobacco, and she smoked a pipe. And she comes in, I get her some water. I take her shoes off, and I'm a little kid, obviously. And I'm talking to her, and all of a sudden she's not talking to me. Next thing I know, I see the pipe falling out of her mouth, and I'm trying to call her, and she's not responding. She starts to slide out of the chair. I try to stop her. Of course, 5-year-old, you're not going to stop an adult from sliding out of the chair. She falls down to the floor of this porch. I have no idea what's wrong with her. Now, again, I'm trying to put this in perspective so you understand how big of a piece of property it is. The nearest house is maybe about a block or so away. And that's my aunt's house. So I finally decide to run to my aunt's house. She's not home. The next nearest house that I knew about that aunt was my grandmother's sister. The other aunt is my mother's sister. She lives a mile down the road. So I just remember this little 5-year-old or 6-year-old, whatever I was. I ran down this road to get to my aunt's house. Her and her husband were there. I tell her what happened. They go back in the car. My grandmother had a stroke. And it's crazy. This is life. That stroke was a catalyst for me coming to New York. I don't know if my mother would have left me down there. I don't know how much longer I would have stayed down there. But, if my grandmother hadn't had that stroke, I very well could have stayed down there. And, we certainly probably wouldn't be talking today. But I know shortly after her stroke, she didn't die. She died a couple years later. I came to New York. And the first place I lived in New York, I'm not going to say the exact, but I remember the address. I lived on 152nd Street between Amsterdam and Broadway. And I lived across the street from the 30th precinct, the old 30th precinct. Like every day you came out, you saw the radio cars. They had a huge garage on the side of the building. And that was my first recollection of the NYPD. And at that age, obviously, I didn't think anything about it other than, oh, it's the police or whatever. And I laugh because from 6 till about 16 or 17, I had 5 encounters with the police, 4 with the NYPD, and 1 was up in Mount Vernon. And the first one had to have been my first week of school when I first got to New York. And the difference for me was where I lived with my grandmother was in the country. The only people you saw were my grandmother, my uncle, or any friend that would come over. You didn't see strangers. You didn't see, there was no variety of people. I rarely saw a white person, it was, it was a black area. And the other thing I didn't know at the time was, this was during the civil rights era. And when I lived with my grandmother, I remember I broke my arm once. My brother shoved me off a porch. They were rebuilding the porch. I broke my arm. It's a Saturday night. So again, because of where we were, we had to get a ride to go. And there were things that I encountered there that I didn't think about for 15 or 20 years. I didn't understand history, of course, at that age. And I think I was watching a documentary years later, and I'm looking at, how the South was when it was segregated before the Civil Rights Act. And I'm like, holy crap. I remember seeing a couple of these, white only colored signs. And I'm like, Jesus Christ. Like, obviously as a child, you wouldn't process that. So I went from this rural setting to New York City, to the 30th precinct. And I went to school up on Amsterdam and 185th Street. I think it was PS 189, which I lived off Amsterdam and 152. So it's a 40-block distance. So I think the second or third day of school, they put me on a school bus that dropped me off at my corner. I walked to my building. On the second or third day, I get put on a bus, and I get the feeling I'm not on the right bus. And I try to tell them, of course, they're not paying any attention, get on and sit down. I sit down, and I remember, it's funny you remember these things from such a young age. I remember being terrified, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't think this is the right bus. What's going to happen? Get on the bus. The bus starts going south on Amsterdam, and I'm like, okay. Now, anybody that works in two truck knows what I'm about to say about the location. We go south of 181st Street. I'm like, oh, great. Well, just south of 181st Street is the entrance to the Harlem River Drive. This bus makes the left and gets on the Harlem River Drive. And at that instant, I was like, okay, this is the wrong bus. I have no idea where I'm going. Nothing I could do. The bus goes down the Harlem River. We get off at 155th Street by the Polo Grounds, which, again, at that age, you would know, but the Polo Grounds, popped into my life a couple times later. Now, I didn't know they were Polo Grounds. I know there's just these huge buildings. The bus driver drops off. Most of the bus gets off there, and he goes one or two more blocks, and it's okay, last stop. I get up and tell this bus driver, listen, this isn't the right bus. I don't know where I am. He just tells me to get off. He throws me off the bus. I think about that now in terms of being an adult and a cop. I'm like, Jesus Christ. But he put me off the bus. So I'm standing on the corner. I think I had like a backpack or something, and I have no idea where I am. The joke about it is, as a cop, I really wasn't far from my house. I was just in a completely different section or neighborhood, if you will. So I'm standing there, and I have no idea what to do. And a guy walking by, I don't know who this man was, thank him. He looks at me, and he goes, are you lost, little boy? No, he said, are you all right, little boy? Something like that. And I'm like, I don't know where I am. He goes, you're lost? And I'm like, yeah. So he goes, well, where do you live at? He starts asking, I have no idea. So he goes, oh, we're going to have to get the police then to come. So again, I'm a little kid. I have no idea. Just as he says this, a 3-2 car, I know it now, was a 3-2 radio cars rolling by, the old black, green, and whites. He flags them down. They stop, 2 cops. They start asking me the questions, and I don't know my phone number. I don't know my address, but I tell them, I go, I do know I live across the street from a police station. So like when I said that, I remember they were like, you do? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, what does the police station look like? So I start describing the 3-0, and, I didn't know this then, but it just, gives you, the understanding of, cops, cops are cops, and, they know their area. And as soon as I started describing it, I think the operator looks at the recorder, and he's like, that sounds like the 3-0. So they're asking me, do you live by the 3-0? I said, I don't know the number. They put me in the car, and it's so funny because of what occurred later in my life. Here I am in the back of this police car. I should be terrified, but I'm thrilled that I'm in the back of a police car. I'm looking up at the speed clock. All the RMPs back then had the speed clock in them to give out speeding summonses. I see the toggle switches for the turret light, the constant siren, the horn siren. I'm like beside myself. The cop uses the radio and tells the dispatcher everything. Long story short, they drive me up. As soon as we approach, I'm like, yep, that's where I live in that block. They drop me off. I go on my way. So that's my first encounter with the NYPD at the age of 6. And my next encounter was the 3-0 precinct again. And it came probably a year or so later. I was probably 7 or 8. There was a school at 155th and Amsterdam, IS 55 or 155. And I think I was in summer school. And I back then, summer school, you could have gone there like if you needed to go, or it was like a daycare type setup. So I was there because my mother was working, and we're walking home. I'm walking home with a couple of friends south on Amsterdam. And, now I know the neighborhood and everything. And there's about 3 kids a couple blocks ahead of us, but they're troublemakers. We know they're troublemakers. So we're purposely staying back not to catch up to them. Long story short, they pulled the fire alarm box. Now we see them pull the fire alarm box. And by the time we got to the fire alarm box, a radio car pulls up. Cop gets out. Hey, you kids, come over here. And we're looking like, who, us? Did you kids pull this fire alarm box? No, we didn't. He says, we got a report that some kids pulled the fire alarm. So we're like, yeah, it was those kids. And we're pointing. These kids are a couple blocks ahead. Cops weren't interested. They put us in the back of the radio car and drive us to the 3-0 precinct. I'm terrified. I'm 7 years old. I'm terrified. I'm like, oh, my God. And we keep telling them it wasn't us. We're in there probably for 20 minutes, a half hour. Finally, some cop comes over and starts asking us, why are you guys here? And we tell him, I don't know who he was or what he did. And we explained to him that it wasn't us. And he goes, all right. I guess he believed us. He writes our names down and tells us to go and don't ever get in trouble, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, okay. And, I left. And I was like, oh, my God. So that's encounter number 2 with the NYPD.
We weren't in trouble anyway. We didn't do it.
No, I was terrified because, like, my mother was a no-nonsense mother. She didn't tolerate crap, Like, you couldn't go out and get in trouble if you wanted to survive. But
I get that. Same way with me.
But well, I'll tell you, when you're a kid, you don't know any better. As an adult, I thank God she was the way she was,
Me too.
But my next encounter came with the 3-2 precinct. We had moved from 152nd Street between Amsterdam and Broadway down to 146 and Bradhurst, right across the street from the old Colonial Pool. So I was in Harlem, and obviously in the right around 1970. Anyone that's my age, that if you lived in Harlem, I would imagine parts of Brooklyn, Brownsville were like this. There were junkies every 10 feet, like nodding junkies every 10 feet. Like what we see now that people are upset about, and they should be, doesn't even compare to what Harlem was like in the 70s. And that's when I kind of first noticed cops. I think at that point I knew I wanted to be a cop, but I first started noticing the NYPD because I knew on Saturday nights and Friday nights TPU was around because the 3-2 was a hotbed. So you'd see TPU cops riding around in Suburbans. I used to see street crime cops riding around, and I saw ESU from time to time. That's actually where I saw my first blue and white REP, the old lollipop lights, they call them, on the back. And of course, at that age, I didn't know I'd, be a cop, let alone be an ESU. But one Saturday, I'm in the supermarket. There's a supermarket on 145th and 8th. It was a supermarket. It was our supermarket. It was like a block down and a block over from my apartment. So I'm in the supermarket with my mother, and we're checking out. We're at the checkout line, and there's a cop in the store. Now, at that point, I knew I wanted to be a cop. So at that point, I was the kid that stopped and stared at police cars. I was the kid that, if I was walking by and there was a police car parked, I looked in just to see the inside of a police car. So this cop is standing at the front, and, again, this is one of those memories you don't forget. I guess he notices me looking at him. I couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. And at some point, he comes over and starts asking me questions. Like, not good questions. What are you doing? Where do you live? And now my mother is a couple of feet away from me. Finally, he says, you got anything on you? Again, I don't know what's he talking about? He tells me to put my hand up, and he starts to frisk me. I'm standing at the checkout line. Well, when he started to frisk me, my mother looks at him and goes, what the hell are you doing? So he starts telling my mother, well, there's been a lot of supermarket robberies, and he keeps looking at me, and I remember this. And I'm looking at his uniform. Of course, he doesn't know. I'm looking. He had a choker coat on. I mean, I know what that is. Afterwards, I know at the time. And my mother says, "Why would you think that he's here to rob a supermarket? We're shopping." And he says, "Well, he goes, he could have a gun." So my mother says, "A gun?" She goes, "He's like 11 and 12 years old." I was always tall, so he didn't believe my age. He was like, "What?" I was actually taller than him, if my memory serves me.
Wow.
And he was, my mother was pissed. My mother was an old-fashioned woman. My mother grew up in the Jim Crow South, so I don't think there was anything in the city of New York that was going to faze my mother. So she had a few choice words with this cop. He backed off and went on his way, and I left. And didn't give me a bad taste or anything like that. I wasn't raised like that. I didn't get in trouble. We weren't allowed to go out. My next encounter was up in the 4-7, because we'd moved out of Harlem up into the 4-7. I lived on Arno Avenue. So got a bicycle one year for Christmas, which I was ecstatic about. And on Saturdays after chores, I would go out and ride bicycles with the neighborhood kids. We'd ride all around the neighborhood. There was like a pack of us, like 8, 10, 12 of us. One Saturday, we're playing hide and seek on bikes. So, I was the seeker. Now it's my turn to hide. I ride a couple blocks up. I turn down a street. It's the kind of thing you look back on, and I'm like, I should have known better. I didn't. I'm guessing I was probably around 13 years old. And I'm riding, and there's other guys riding down the block on the opposite side. Some guys hide behind cars because you got to hide yourself in your bike. I go down a driveway, which was a mistake. I go to a driveway figuring I'll hide in this back of this house, and I'm looking out. And when the seeker goes by, my plan is to ride out and get back to base. I didn't know when I went down this driveway, someone in the house saw me. I realized years later this guy was probably a retired cop, although at the time I had no idea, because here I am waiting and I'm looking out, and all of a sudden a guy comes out of the house with a gun in his hand, a handgun. I didn't know at the time he had a .38 special, like a service gun in his hand.
Oh, he had to have been a cop then.
And he says to me, "Oh, what are you doing back here?" And he thought I was back there to steal his scooter. He had a Vespa scooter back there, and I'm like, "I'm not trying to steal your scooter." I'm telling him I'm playing hide and seek, At this point, there's kids all up and down the block because we're hiding on this block. And I assumed later on he was a cop, because he must have called the police, because there was a radio car there in less than 5 minutes. So a black, green, and white radio car pulls up, and they weren't fazed with him with his gun. He still had his gun in his hand. So I'm like, and I'm telling this cop we're playing hide and seek. Now at this point, the rest of the crew is right here. And it's a bunch of neighborhood kids. It was an Italian neighborhood. It was black kids, white kids, a couple of Spanish kids. Thank God the cops were reasonable, because they realized, they're playing hide and seek. And, I left. Don't go in. I was like, never again. And I didn't. I should have known better. I didn't. My fault. But they took me home. Thank God my mother wasn't there, or God knows what would have happened to me. But one of my neighbors comes out, and she's like, "Oh, what happened?" So he tells her, she goes, "I just want to talk to his mother." She goes, "Oh, I'll tell his mother." Then her brother, who I knew, her brother was a cop, was an NYPD. I don't know where he worked. He comes out. I see him show his shield, and he tells him, "Well, we'll talk to his mother." It's like, he's usually a good kid, but we'll let her know. And now I'm like petrified, like, God, what's going to happen to me? And, nothing bad happened. And that was my last childhood encounter with the NYPD. The next police encounter I had was in Mount Vernon. I was probably 16 or 17. The one time in my life I went out on Halloween with friends, and we were throwing eggs. We were throwing eggs at cars, throwing eggs at houses, which is not something I did. I really didn't do that. So at the end of the night, thank God all our eggs were gone. We must have thrown an egg at the wrong car, because this guy was pissed. He called the police. A cop shows up. And he starts asking us questions. We're like, "No, we don't have any eggs. They were all gone." So, he checks us, makes sure we don't have eggs, sends us on our way. And I remember, as I wasn't a kid, I remember saying to myself, "Okay, enough of this. You can't be out here getting into trouble in the streets." And I laughed. Those are my 5 encounters with the police, growing up from the young age of 6 up to about 16 or 17. So. But you want me to keep going?
Yeah, it's your story. You tell it as you see fit.
But after that, what happened with me is, I started working when I was young. I first took my first jobs when I was about 16 years old, help out my mother, that kind of thing. And I had a brother, a couple of sisters, and our life growing up was actually pretty good up until, believe it or not, as much. I'm a political junkie now. I have been for years, and at the time, I wasn't into politics, obviously, as a kid, but our life was actually pretty good, and I realized it as an adult until the recession in like 74, 75. That was the same recession that caused all the cops and firemen and city workers being laid off. Of course, as a kid, I wasn't paying attention to that, and our life changed. It became difficult. It became it's the word I'm looking for. There was some adversity, and I tell my kids these stories because my kids didn't have to go through this. Like, my mother was a great mother, took care of us. Thank God, never lost our house or anything like that. Came close once or twice, but never homeless. But during that period, and I say this because I guess how you grow up or what you experience in life, prepares you for the future. And I'm like, the thought process today is foreign to me. I'm from a generation where, listen, you run into adversity, you deal with it. And I look back on it, and the worst time in my childhood growing up was, during that period. There were some days where, our house ran out of food, like on a Monday or Tuesday, and mom wasn't getting paid until Friday. And when I say no food, I mean literally no. There was nothing in the house. There might have been a couple pieces of bread. There was nothing. And I laugh because I think about this today when I hear some politicians go after school lunches. And I'm like, out of all the things the government wastes money on, you're going to go after school lunches. When we were going through that period, and this wasn't all the time, but the only thing we ate was when we went to school. And I laugh because, some people, the thought process today is, oh, if you want something, go steal it. You don't have it. That was never an option, never a thought process with us. It just didn't work. And, other than that, like I said, things were good. I can't complain about my upbringing. My mother was an old fashioned mother. She didn't tolerate a lot of crap, kept us on the straight and narrow. But when you're a kid, you don't realize, and I always say this, well, if you let kids do whatever they want to do, they're going to get into trouble. So, my mother kept us out of trouble. And I would say my adult life started, I think I knew I wanted to be a cop probably since I was about 10 or 11 years old. And it came from watching Dragnet, Adam 12. Probably, if you asked me to pick my absolute favorite police show, and it's funny because I'm actually watching the reruns now on Police Story, which was written by an ex-LA cop. And Police Story, I always tell people, you really want to know what police work, even though this show's from the 70s, watch Police Story, because Police Story, my God, they covered everything. They covered patrol. They covered, at that time when women were first coming on, they had episodes about the SWAT team, about detectives, about everything. And I remember watching this, and I laughed because I was saying to you before about your LA guests recently. My dream as a kid, believe it or not, until I was about 15 years old, I wanted to be an LA cop. And I was like, I was going to go to LA. And I remember talking to my sister and friends, like, do you know anybody in LA? I'm like, no, but you can just go there. And I was going to be an LA cop. And it's funny because, like, my opinion about the NYPD, you have some cops that become disgruntled and they complain about the job. I love the NYPD. It has its warts. It's a great organization. It's not perfect by any stretch, but I kind of chuckle, and it's not a knock on LA because I think LA is a great department. But I thank God that I got the NYPD bug, and it's funny what got me the NYPD bug. I was a news junkie as a child, which is probably unusual. That's because of my mother. My mother used to bring a newspaper home every day. And probably somewhere around the age of 6 or 7, I started reading the newspaper. And when I say every day, I mean every day. Like, if it was a day she was off, I went out to get the paper. And at some point, it went from one paper to 2 papers. was the Daily News and the Post. So I am, this kid reading 2 newspapers a day. So what I would see in the newspaper, I'd see police stories. She got me into watching the news. I stopped reading the newspaper in 2020, but I still watch the news every day. And it's funny because I remember this incident like it was yesterday, because I saw it in the newspaper and I saw it on the news. I didn't know at the time. I know now what I was seeing. Probably Adam 1. Like ESU has had, I we'll get into it later, my involvement with the vehicles and everything. But ESU's had a variety of REPs over the inception of ESUs. Like everyone knows the truck that's on the patch, that was the original vehicle. But after that, ESU REPs were actually 2-door sedans back in the 30s into the 40s. And in the trunk, they carried equipment. They had some equipment. And in the 70s, ESU went through a period where the REPs were station wagons. And I remember seeing some of them up north. But there was a job where one truck, and I'm trying to remember, I think they went to someone in the water, or they pulled someone out of the water, or maybe it was a heart attack. And they were on the piers on the west side. Now, the west side piers back in the 70s were nothing like what's there now, the shipyard. They were warehouses. And what made this job unusual is, if you didn't grow up in New York City, you didn't know this. In the 70s and the 80s, you called an ambulance, it was not unusual to wait an hour or 2 or 3. And I'm talking about, you could call an ambulance and say someone's been shot, and 2 hours later, you're still there. That was common. I remember seeing news stories about this. Well, here's Adam 1 who has this guy. They're treating him, I guess, with oxygen or whatever, and they can't get an ambulance. So what they did, I don't know who the cops were. I just remember the story. They took all the equipment out of the station wagon. They unloaded the REP, dropped it on the pier, left it with a precinct cop, put the guy in an ambulance in the back of the REP, the station wagon, and took him to Bellevue. Then went back and got their equipment. And that made the news. And I remember spreading the paper. And that was my first real notice of ESU. And I was like, who the hell are these cops? Like, these aren't regular cops. And that started me realizing, I think I want to be an NYPD cop and I want to get an ESU. And the other catalyst for me was 2 books. One book was called On the Beat. And I know I have a copy of it somewhere, probably in my basement somewhere. And it was a kid's book. And the front of the book was a picture of a black, green, and white radio car. It's a black and white book. And you see 2 cops, a black cop and a white cop, running out of this car into a call. In the book, there's pictures, there's stories. They explain, the one cop lives in the suburbs, the one cop lives in the city, the one cop drives to work, the one cop takes the train to work, and it just showed them going on jobs. So now when you first pick this book up, you see this radio car. As you go through, and it's a small book, as you go through the book, you get to the middle of it. The second part of the book is about ESU, which I laughed. I'm like, they didn't even mention this on the front. So I know who she was. I've never met her. I think she just passed away. But it's actually one of the first women in ESU, Ann Morrissey. It's ironic. I've known Ann Morrissey's name. She was, I think, her and Helen Needlehands were the first 2 women in ESU.
Yes.
I've known her name since I was a kid. Like, she wouldn't know me from a hole in the wall, but I knew who she was. Well, she's in this book, and I didn't know at the time, but she was assigned to 2 truck. They had a blue and white, the first actual rescue-style body that ESU had. That was their REP. They showed the equipment in the book. They showed 2 trucks' quarters, which I laughed because obviously I would get to know it very well. But so I'm reading this book, and like, after seeing the ESU section, I wanted nothing to do with the front of the book. And I'm like, okay. And then the other one is a book written in the 70s. And the name of the book is called Some Very Special Men. And the book, that was the title. And the cover of it was the old round ESU patch before they added the word police. And that's what got my attention in the library. And I picked this book up and I read it. I couldn't put it down. It was actually like reading an action story. Because this book was about the exploits of ESU from, I think, the 40s up to around the 70s. And it had jobs, it had stories, there's names in there. And after reading that book when I was probably 14 or 15, that's when I was like, okay, I want to be an ESU cop. Of course, having no clue how to do that, you got to be a cop first. And Probably when I was about, I think back in those days, I think you had to be 17 and a half to take a police test. Because unlike today, police tests were, my God, 30, 40, 50,000 people would take the police test. Like if you took the police test, even if you passed it, you'd be waiting years to get called. Like today, if you took a test, you'd hear from them probably in 6 months or a year. It was years. So then I guess the logic was, well, if you take this test at 17 and a half, by the time we call you, you'll be like 21. So when I was about 17 and a half, I started taking tests. I took the NYPD test. I took the transit police test, the New York State Police test, the corrections test, the court officer test, the Yonkers test. I passed all of these tests, and it was just a waiting game basically after that. And high school, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do after high school. I knew I wanted to be a cop, and something that happened to me. It's not the norm, but I wasn't getting along with my mother, and it wasn't so much I wasn't getting along with her. I realized, I think what it was is I think my mother was not accepting the fact that you're not a little kid anymore, you're growing up. And like I said, I was not a kid that ran the streets. That no one in my family were. We weren't allowed to do that. And I think my mother just kind of didn't want to cut the apron string, so to speak. So believe it or not, I look back on it, it's my life. My entire senior year in high school, I had my own apartment. And
Really?
The entire senior year, I worked over the summer at the Bronx Zoo. I met a guy there, Kerry. I can't remember his last name. He was from somewhere up by Rochester. And we were friends, and we used to hang out together. And he's like, "Oh, I'm from there," but he goes, "I'm going to stay down there." We decided to get an apartment together, and I'm like, "Oh, should I?" And I was like, "Okay." I think I had turned 18, or I was about to, and I was like, "I'll be 18 by then." And I was like, "Ah, I guess I'll just tell my mother I'm moving out." So I do. Of course, she wasn't thrilled about it, but the only reason I did this is because I was sharing the rent with this guy. He was there for 2 weeks and he disappeared. Left me a note. "Okay, I'm going back upstate. Goodbye, good luck." And I was like, "What the?" So here I am in high school in 12th grade with my own apartment. So what that forced me to do is, and I look back on it, it is what it is. I spent my entire senior year going to high school during the day, and I worked a full-time job. I worked 7 days a week. And that was the only way I could make money to keep my apartment and pay, for gas and electric. I used to get out of school around 2:15 or so, and I would walk to a cab stand that was a couple blocks from my house. I drove a cab, and I would work from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 11 at night. That was Monday through Friday. On Saturdays, I would work from 8 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. And on Sundays, I would work from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6. Got off early. But that was my entire senior year, and I was just making enough money to pay my bills. I didn't have time to hang out with friends, obviously. I mean, I look back on it now, at the time, you're not thrilled about it, but I couldn't afford to go to prom. I couldn't afford to go to graduation. I couldn't afford to like I said, I was just making enough money to pay my rent. And I guess I'm of the old school of, adversity builds character. And, I tell my kids these and I laugh. And I was like, you guys have had it, had it made. I laugh thanks to me, but I tell them it's actually thanks to my mother, my grandmother, and I said, the stuff I went through, you guys never had to go through. I'm sure my kids probably at times wanted to leave also, where they thought I was being overbearing, but I adopted my mother's attitude, like tough luck. I always told them, listen, when you hit 18, if you feel like strongly about it, I won't hold you. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. But that's what I did, for my senior year. And after high school, I decided I was going to join the Army. I said, I'll join the Army. My brother had gone into the Army. My brother was in Germany. Unlike today, where no matter where you are, you could pick up a cell phone and call someone, back then you couldn't. It didn't work that way. And I decided I was going to go in the Army. And I'd always wanted to go in the Army. And I didn't. And, if you ask me two of the greatest regrets in my life, believe it or not, one of them was the fact that I didn't, serve in the military when I was 18. I mean, I'm one of those people, like, if it was up to me, I believe in a draft. I've always felt that way. I'm not one of these people where it's like, it's good enough for someone else's kid. I just think from I don't even know if I use the word patriotism. Just, I just think that this country, I mean, there's a lot of turmoil going on now. I just think it's a good thing for the country, for people to realize, there's something besides you. And like I said, I was going to go to the Army, and you talk about how some things happen that change your plans. I contacted a recruiter. I was about to go process, and one of my friends from high school decides, I think I'm going to join the Army too. And he kind of like tags along with me. He starts the process also. And I laugh because if he hadn't, I'm pretty sure I would have got into the Army. Long story short, we go down to Fort Dix one day. They pick you up at 3:00 in the morning, get into Fort Dix bright and early in the morning, spend the whole day testing, processing. And at the end of the day, the way it worked then, I don't know, I guess it still works the same way now. If you pass everything, you sign like a contract, I guess. And I was going to be an MP because I knew I wanted to be a cop. And I figured, okay, this is a jumping, a good start, give me some experience. And the other thing, and again, this is an 18-year-old who didn't know any better. I was like, the only other thing I want is I don't want to leave the United States. I didn't care where I was stationed in the United States. I wasn't interested in going overseas, which, like I said, is ironic because my brother was in Germany. My brother loved his time in the Army in Germany. Anyway, so at the end of the day, they come out, you both pass, you got to look over and they look, okay, you're both going to be MP. Yep. Okay, you're good. You're checked. And it comes to the stationing point. This was a lieutenant. And he goes, okay, and you're going to be stationed in Italy. I go, Italy? And I said to him, I don't want to go to Italy. And he goes, what do you mean you don't want to go to Italy? He goes, that's where the opening, you want to be an MP? I go, yeah. I said, I just told I was going to Colorado or something like that. I'd never been to Colorado. And I laughed because I've told my son this story. And I'm like, I was an idiot. I was like, you're 18. Someone's offering you to go to Italy for free. Of course you go. I didn't know any better. So I'm sitting there and, he leaves for a while. He goes, okay, let me check. And they'll check. And he goes, there's no openings anywhere in the U.S. for MPs. So, they give you a little while to make a decision. And I'm talking to my friend and he's like, oh, and like I said, I'm not a follower, but I should have made the decision on my own and say, to hell with it, I'm going to go anyway. Long story short, I didn't go. And, I regretted it later on. I always regret it. I was just something I should have done. And now I have to find a job. And after high school, again, I have this apartment I have to pay for. So I get a job in a factory in Mount Vernon, semi-alloys, I remember. I think I worked there for 2 months. The worst job I've ever had in my life. It was just a mundane job in a factory making these machine parts, boring to tears, And I was like, okay, I won't be doing this. Well, while I was there, I saw an EMT course advertised somewhere. So I signed up for an EMT course. And this course was given at Jacoby because back then they had just a few years earlier started the paramedic program in New York City. And what do you call it? So I used to go to Jacoby Hospital. I think it was 3 nights a week in the evening after working all day to get the EMT certificate. In the meantime, to keep myself busy in my first foray into like public service, at the time, Mount Vernon had volunteer firemen. And I became a volunteer fireman. I think you can join when you were 18. So I became a volunteer fireman. I did that for probably a year and a half, 2 years. Interesting. Got some good training. Got to use the hose a couple times. Got to crawl around in a smoke-filled apartment once looking for, without a Scott pack on. I was like, Jesus Christ. That was an experience. And, I says, I'm still too young to be a cop, so I was going to go the CMT route. So I become an EMT. I get through the course, I pass it, and I wanted to work in New York City, but at the time, I don't know how it works now. You couldn't just go there and say, okay, I'm an EMT. I want to work. That's not how they did it. Like city jobs, you got to wait until their openings. So I have all these police tests that I've taken, and still waiting. I couldn't get into EMS because they weren't hiring at the time. So I took a job with a private ambulance company, AA Ambulance, which was on Webster and 181 in the 4-8. And private ambulance work is, I mean, if you want to be EMT and you're not looking for any kind of excitement, it's a job, but it's medical transport. You're transporting older people, mostly sometimes out of nursing homes into nursing homes. Every now and then you get an emergency call. Like, I was surprised at this. Like, if someone in a nursing home was having like trouble breathing or even heart, they wouldn't call they'd call the private ambulance service. So you'd get it as an emergency call and you'd have to go. So I did that, and I was not thrilled with it. I was bored, but again, I'm waiting to hit the age of 21. Well, at some point, Mount Vernon, which I lived in Mount Vernon for, my God, I lived in Mount Vernon for about 20 years. Mount Vernon used to have 2 ambulances, and the Mount Vernon ambulances worked out of Mount Vernon Hospital. I didn't know this. I don't think anyone knew this. They were not staffed by EMTs. They were staffed by the security guards. Like, an ambulance call would come in, 2 security guards would get into the ambulance and go. They called it scoop and run and grab you up, maybe throw an oxygen mask on you, take you to the hospital. So Mount Vernon decided to get with the time and decided to contract a private ambulance service to provide EMS. And who won the contract? AA Ambulance, my ambulance company. So I was ecstatic, and I was like, wait, what? I knew the owner there, and I says, oh, I'm going to go to Mount Vernon, right? I live in Mount Vernon. So I go up there, and that was my first real foray into, emergency service with the public, with responding to calls. And Mount Vernon had a bad reputation, but there was nothing crazy going on there. I think my God, I had 3 or 4 shootings in the whole time I was up there. You got some stabbings, a lot of car accidents, a lot of heart attacks and things like that. But it gave me a foray into, emergency work. And I think everything that I did up until the day I got into ESU, I realized this a long time ago, prepared me to go into ESU and like hit the ground running. And that's because of the type of unit ESU is and the type of work it does. Like, when I was in ESU, we would get new people in who, they wanted to be at ESU, but like they had no background in, certain types of things. This was all new to them. When I got into ESU, I kind of had a head start, and it all came from all of this. Like, at Mount Vernon, I think working up there, because I worked mostly Mount Vernon, but sometimes Bronxville, Yonkers, New Rochelle, and then after a while, I went with another company. It was up in White Plains, and Mount Vernon was, I think, the place where, believe it or not, I think 3 or 4 cases I had of, death that actually taught me how to prepare, or prepared me to deal with, death, which I think people in emergency service, like firemen, cops, EMTs, doctors, nurses, for people in these professions, you're used to it. But you deal with so much death. It's not that you don't become numb to it, but it's routine. Like, the amount of death back in the late 80s, early 90s, the crack epidemic. Myself and one of my old partners, once I kept a list. I was curious. I was like, you realize we see more dead people in 6 months than like 10 people see in their entire lifetime? And the Mount Vernon years prepared me for that. One of the calls I remember was we had an accident one Sunday afternoon on Hudson River Parkway and 3rd Street, like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A car hit a tree. We get there. It's a bunch of young girls, new driver, these parents that put a brand new driver into a car. The driver was like 16 or 17, and they hit a tree getting off, and it was something, the type of accident is completely avoidable, but they're new. They missed their exit. All they had to do was go one exit and turn around. When my kids grew up and they started learning how to drive, I told them, if you ever miss an exit, just don't be that person that goes from the left lane over. And that's what happened. They came over, the girl lost control, and all the girls were okay except for one. A couple of them were banged up. And when I get there, I was the first ambulance there, and the county police in Mount Vernon was there. There's a young girl in the back seat, and I could tell she's out. And I'm still a fairly new EMT. I've got like maybe a year under my belt. I'm still learning that trade. And I realized, like, I think this girl's neck is broken, and it turns out it was. We get her out, start doing CPR, get her to the hospital. She died. She's 16 years old. I don't know her name. Never forgotten this call. And that was probably the first time I really dealt with death. And I was just like, Jesus Christ, she's only 16. We found out the story. Another one was one day I'm working in Bronxville on an ambulance, and we get a pin job. And a car and a truck, and probably the first time, and certainly not the last, that I would deal with a case where, there's someone trapped in a car and there's a bumper of a truck inside the car. Like the bumper of the truck is literally like inches from this guy's head. Young man, 20, he was older than me, 22, 23, had an accident with a truck. Bronxville at the time, fire department had a rescue truck. I remember they used their hearse tool. That was the first time I'd ever seen a hearse tool used to get the door off. Go in, treating this kid. I call him a kid, but I say that now, but he was, treating this young man. His vital signs were good. Nothing was broken. We get him to the hospital. Talking to him the whole way. Nice guy. All he wants to do is talk to his, call my parents. He lived in Connecticut. And if you're familiar with the area, Bronxville and Connecticut, as long as you're not trying to do it in rush hour, you're talking about like a 20-minute car ride, you're in Connecticut.
Yep.
So I tell him, yeah, when we get to the hospital, we'll call your parents. We get in, they're checking him out, call his parents, and I'm watching him. He's on the phone talking to his mother. He's telling her, I'm fine, I'm fine. The nurses are like, yeah, he's okay. We're going to have him here. So, when you're an EMT and you drop someone off, most of the times, you just go on your way. So I'm done with him. I'm leaving. As we're leaving, I'm restocking the ambulance. As I'm walking out the door, I hear over the hospital PA, like code blue ICU or something. I don't think anything of it, or whatever floor it was. I leave, get another call, wind up back at the hospital dropping off a patient like an hour later. And one of the nurses goes, oh, did you hear? And I go, did I hear what? She goes, that guy you brought in, he died. Like, I was like, what?
Yeah.
The guy from the accident? And she goes, yeah, he died. And I was new to this profession, so I didn't think she was joking, but I was like, what do you mean he died? And she said he coded, and I realized he was the code I heard over the PA when I was leaving. Of course, I wouldn't know this. Apparently, when he got upstairs, he crapped out, as the expression goes. And it's funny because, like I say, when you're in this profession, you learn as you go along. You get to a point where you become, the quote-unquote expert, but that comes from experiences. And I'm like, I don't get it, because when you're a medic, obviously you can administer medications, the mask pants and everything. When you're not a medic, there's certain things you could do. If you think someone has internal bleeding, besides oxygen or whatever, you can, reposition them to prevent blood loss and certain things, lifting, elevating their legs. Long story short, this kid apparently in this accident, he had a seatbelt on, somehow his liver got ruptured. And the liver is the largest organ in the body, largest supply of blood, and it all depends how badly it's injured. If it's injured badly, you can die within minutes. If it's not injured that severe and they don't catch you, you'll die. Apparently, when they took him into the OR, he was such a young kid, they were trying to save him. They cut him open. His liver had been so badly lacerated that what was going on, and there were no vital signs to show this. Normally, you would see like maybe pale color, change in blood pressures. He was fine until he crapped out. And they were like, his liver ruptured and he basically bled to death. And that again, here I am talking about it. This is back in 1980. And I still remember this. Another Mount Vernon caper was a little closer to home for me. One day I'm working a Saturday day tour. And the tours are 8 to 4, 4 to 12, 12 to 8. And it's like 3:30. And my shift is almost over, and I'm getting some lunch, first chance to get lunch, and I'm on Gramerton Avenue with Pizza King getting pizza, probably the most popular pizza spot in Mount Vernon back then. And I see a friend, a young lady I went to school with. I went to high school with her in junior high school, Virginia Chaffee. I still remember her name, 18 years old. So she sees me, we're chatting. She's with her boyfriend. He's in a car. How you doing? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. Let's talk for a few minutes. All right, take care, Virginia. See you again. I get into the ambulance. I go back to the firehouse. She makes the turn on Prospect, and they drive off. So I'm back in the firehouse because our ambulance base was an old Mount Vernon firehouse. And I'm sitting there, and I'm starting to eat the pizza, and they call us for an accident on the Bronx River Parkway, the city line, overturned vehicle. So I was going to go, but it was near the end of our shift. So the next shift was like, oh, no, we'll take it. Because one of the guys in the next shift was the supervisor. And I always said, I guess it's just as well. So he goes on this call. I eat my pizza, finish my tour, go home. 7 o'clock, I get a phone call from a friend of mine who knew I worked on the ambulance, and he goes, "Oh, did you hear about Virginia?" And I'm like, "Virginia who? Virginia?" I go, "Hear what?" He tells me she was killed in an accident. And I'm like, "What?" And believe it or not, that one, because it was someone I knew, I was like, "Wait a second, where did this happen?" As soon as he told me where it was, like my mind was like, I was like, "So let me get this straight. Here's a girl I was talking to. 5 minutes after I was talking to her, like where I saw her made that turn, they must have headed for the Bronx area. I don't know what the hell was up with her boyfriend. She didn't have a seatbelt on because she was thrown out, but she was killed. I still remember her name, and like I said, I was shocked. I was like, "Oh my God!" And that kind of, like I said, prepared me for, what was going to be my profession. Like it's sad to say that death, especially working in and around New York City, it's just part of your career. There are places where, they have obviously cops, firemen, ambulances, but they don't deal with the amount of death you deal with. And, those three cases I mentioned, like I said, here I am 40 years later, still talking about them. I just remembered them. And, my time in Mount Vernon on the ambulances was pretty good. Like I said, it helped me hone my skills in EMT. And even though I knew that was going to be my career, I figured it would be helpful as a cop and helpful as an ESU cop. And I think I did that for a couple of years. Like AA lost the contract, and then another company got it. So I went to that company to stay working there until what happened was I got called for New York City EMS. But it's not funny, but I've heard you mention his name before. But I always say that I was talking to someone else, I'll call it my first unofficial collar. I wasn't a cop yet. It was in Mount Vernon. And one of the things I did, because I knew I wanted to work in the police department, I used to listen to a scanner. The volunteer firemen up there were no beepers or anything. You had to have a scanner to listen to the calls. They had the horns that blew around the town, but then they knocked those out and they went to scanner calls. And so what I would listen to, of course, the Mount Vernon fire frequency was dead. They didn't have that many fires. And even the police frequency wasn't too busy. And, I got to learn the lingo, as you would call it. Like Mount Vernon at that time, I think still the ambulance were dispatched by the police department. So we had a police radio. So you heard all the police calls. So what I would do in the firehouse, our ambulance base, is I'd listen to the 4-7 and I would listen to SOD radio. And, I laugh, before I came on the job, I knew the radio jargon, the codes, the whole 9 yards. So I forget the night it was, but one night I hear on SOD radio, a cop shot in the 3-2. This is sometime in the late evening. Then I hear a description, it was a cop shot, cop died, we found out from listening to radio, and the suspect escaped. So I'm like, oh, okay. I just had this information in my head. So hours later, I think I was doing a double that night. That's why I was still around. Hours later, because I know it was around 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning, I hear the Mount Vernon police dispatcher, who was a cop at the time, I knew him, give a call to one of the units for a man shot in the ER. Like, I was like, we didn't have any calls for any shootings anywhere in Mount Vernon. So the unit answers. And in my head, I'm sitting there going, is this possible that this is the guy the city's looking for? But, when I wasn't a cop, didn't want to play cop. But in my head, I'm like, could this possibly be the guy? So what I do is I call the dispatcher up, since I knew him. And I'm like, Mike, I says, you gave out a job for, he goes, yeah. He goes, yeah. He goes, we don't know where it happened. I said, do you know there was a city cop killed like about 2 or 3 hours ago in Harlem? And they're looking for a guy? And he goes, no. He never heard it. So I tell him, yeah, there was a cop shot and killed in 3-2 precinct about 3 hours ago. And I gave him a description, male, black, 5-something that fled. They think he was shot. And he's like, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, I'm going to call the 4-7. So he calls the 4-7 and finds out, yeah. Now, Mount Vernon, since they cooperate better, like Mount Vernon now has, Robert Billadu. Mount Vernon and the 4-7 for decades now, they have the radios at the desk. But for whatever reason back then, they didn't. So I call him up. He tells the unit to stand by, sends another unit. Long story short, this guy that walked into Mount Vernon Hospital was the guy that killed Robert Billadu. And I laugh. I mean, I know this story because I know what I did, but I laugh. Of course, I'm not part of the story. Like, I'm not mentioning it. He went there and, oh, he's here. And I was like, holy crap. So, Mike calls me and he goes, how did you find this out? So I'm telling him, and he's like, oh my God, thank God you called. I'm like, well, I'm sure you guys would have figured it out at some point. But I don't know what story this guy would tell him, but I was like, Jesus Christ. So
Before you continue, let me just give the audience a little context on Billadu, because I knew exactly as soon as you mentioned Harlem that it was him. Billadu is one of the more decorated cops in NYPD history, and he's the only cop in the history of the NYPD to get the Medal of Honor twice. One was posthumously for getting killed in the line of duty in 1980. Him and his partner stopped 6 suspicious men. They took off. One of the animals turned around and shot him during the foot pursuit. But before that, the year before, Billadu had almost died in 1979. He was on an undercover detail, and some maniac slashed his throat. And there was an opportunity there to leave the job on 3/4. He almost got his artery cut. He survived that, got patched up, came back to the job, got killed in the line of duty a year later.
Well,
so he's the only guy in police history to get the Medal of Honor twice.
What's ironic about it is I didn't know who it was until the next day. They didn't release his name until the next day, but his stabbing I knew about being a news junkie. Because when he was stabbed, it was big news. He was cut from his ear straight across his neck, took like over 100 stitches. And they had a picture of him, like, I don't know if it was recovery. He was still bandaged, but it was the same guy. And, here he winds up getting killed a year later in Harlem. I was like, geez.
Street crime cop.
Yep. And, like I said, I knew as soon as I saw the name of who it was, I'm like, this is the guy that got stabbed a year ago, got cut a year ago. So, as far as Mount Vernon, like I said, I stayed there until what happened was New York City EMS finally opened up, and I applied to go to work for New York City EMS and go through the processing. I had my EMT certificate. I go get hired. And I'm like, oh, great. I'm going to get a chance to work in the city. I'm thinking hopefully I'll work in the Bronx and I'll get way more experience than I get in Mount Vernon. And I would say maybe 3 or 4 days before we started, we went to EMS headquarters. Used to be on, I don't know if it's still there, 58th Street by Master, which ironically I didn't know this at the time. Literally, it's on the same street as where CRS is, the NYPD Central Repair Shop, a place I would spend God knows how much time in, but at the time I didn't know. And what they tell us is, and this is in 1980, what they tell us is listen, we're about to switch from their old carded dispatching to computerized dispatching, and you guys are the ones that are going to do it. And we're like, what? And in my head, I'm like, I didn't join EMS to work inside. I hated working inside. And, I was like, oh, my God. So it's a choice. It was a raise. They paid better. So I wound up going. And because EMS dispatching, believe it or not, in 1980, they still use index card. You got a call, you wrote it down, and you stuck it into the borough slot. They had the 5 dispatchers: Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island. That's how they used to. So they went from that to computerized dispatching. And I was in that group, and they told us, I was like, how long are we going to be in here? It says probably at least 6 months. And I'm like, oh, my God. 6 months to a year, they were saying. And I was like, okay, am I going to be able to survive this? So I started out taking calls. Then I went to dispatching. I used to dispatch Bronx EMS. And, even that was an interesting experience. I had some funny calls there, which I kind of laughed because one of the calls I had I had tears rolling down my cheeks laughing about it. And I laughed because little did I know years later, I didn't know I'd be in ESU, but ESU would be called. There was a family that called that said their cat attacked them. And I'm like, what do you mean your cat attacked? Like I can hear the fear in this person's voice, but it sounded like a joke. And she's like, we're hiding in the closet, and my mother's in this closet, and I'm like biting my tongue not to laugh. And the way it worked there is, you could be on the phone with the caller, the PD, and the fire department all in one shot. You could all be talking to each other. So like, yeah, the police are coming, and they're like, oh, they're probably going to have to call ESU. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, I don't know, I'm like, okay. And that just was one of the funnier ones. I mean, the most notable call was one night I'm working. I used to work midnights, but this time I was doing a 4-by, and you always knew when something was real because, the amount of calls. Like, you knew, it was rare that if it was a bad accident or a shooting, you'd get 1 or 2 calls. You'd get 10, 20, 30 calls. And this night we started getting calls for someone shot on Central Park West. And my first thing, I didn't know the city that well, even though I, grew up there. And I'm like, nobody gets shot on Central Park West. Like, who the hell was shot at Central Park West at 9 o'clock in the evening? And the calls keep coming in. I talked to one guy, and he said, yeah, this guy shot this guy, and the guy's on the ground, and, we need an ambulance for him. And I'm explaining. I said, can you tell me anything? He goes, no, the people are holding the guy down. And I'm like, okay. And then the guy I'm talking to says to me, oh, the police just pulled up. And I was like, okay, if the police are there, sir, that's good. And I hang up. Come to find out 15 minutes later, the person shot was John Lennon. And I was like, the John Lennon? I was like, yeah, it was John Lennon. I was like, holy crap. And of course, you'd see later on the news, but I was like, Jesus. And it kind of, that one kind of made me realize, okay, working in the city's a little different than working in Westchester County somewhere. And, what happened is I stayed in there doing this dispatching. And they started letting us go out to do overtime in the morning if you want out in the streets. And I was like, yeah, I didn't join EMS to work inside. I don't want to stay here. Anyone that wanted to stay could say I wanted out. So I used to go up to Jacoby Hospital and work in ambulance after my midnight. I'd work from, whatever time I got up there till about 3 in the afternoon, which I love being out in the streets. That's when I got to, start to understand how things work out in the street, how the cops work, the firemen, the EMS. And I did that for a while. I had it's funny thinking about all the, you went from having 1 or 2 shootings a year, if you were lucky, to having them constant. I mean, it got to a point where you had so many shootings. Like, this is why New York City is New York City, and why the people that provide emergency service here are so good at it, because you have so much experience. Like, you'd see a gunshot wound. I mean, by the time I was a cop, you'd see a gunshot wound. Any experienced cop in a busy area could say, you could look at the wound and tell what caliber bullet it is and be right like 99% of the time. And, as an EMT, obviously you want to know where the bullet struck, and entrance, exit wounds and all that stuff. So when I tell you I got to see a little bit of everything working for EMS, that was an education that's remarkable. And I finally got out of there and went out into Jacoby, and I worked Jacoby for a short while. I mean, my time at Jacoby, again, the call that sticks out with me is this poor little kid. One Saturday afternoon, and it's ironic. I laugh because this is my life. I guess this is part of being in New York City. One Saturday afternoon at about 3, we get a call for a kid not breathing on Arno Avenue, literally 2 blocks from where I lived as a kid. The story I told you about with the bike. It was on the corner of that block, and I'm like, oh, I know where that is. We get there. No radio car, run in, kid not breathing. Wound up snatching the kid up from his mother. I was doing CPR on the kid. We took it to Jacoby. We couldn't take the mother with us. I hated to leave her there. I said, the police are coming in. The police brought her in. And we get the kid in, 3-year-old little kid. Couldn't tell you the kid's name, but I could see the kid's face today. Beautiful little boy. And wound up getting his heartbeat back, which I was ecstatic. It was the first time I'd ever done CPR where someone came back. I was ecstatic. Nice. So my tour finishes, go home, call the ICU, Peds ICU, check on the kid. He's holding his own. Okay, good. Before I go to bed, I call. Nope, he's still doing good. I was talking to the nurse. You know who I was. So I go to bed. I'm ecstatic. I get up the next morning. I'm very happy. I'm like, oh, when I start the tour, I think we started at 7 o'clock. I'm like, oh, we'll go check on this kid. Get ready, get the ambulance ready, go check on the kid. He died at like 4 o'clock in the morning. I was so shocked, heartbroken, if you want to call it that. And I was like, oh my God, I thought this poor kid was going to make it. Such a young kid. And, he passed away. Again, one of those things that sticks with you. And I was only in Jacoby, like out in the streets full time for about 2 weeks, and they transferred us to Manhattan because Manhattan was having issues. EMS was always understaffed. So they're like, oh, you're going to go work out of Bellevue. And I'm like, Bellevue? Like Jacoby was 15 minutes from my house. I was like, okay, I didn't want to go. But they started something called TAC buses, which were ambulances that instead of being confined to an area, we had like the whole of Manhattan South. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And it's funny because one of your past interviewers, I don't know how I forgot this, Patty Pogan. When I'm
My longest interview.
Patty Pogan, and it hits me. Patty Pogan was one of my bosses when he was a lieutenant when I was in EMS down in Bellevue. And I remembered because I knew him, and I remember going into an ER once, and I see him there with this nurse, and he's kissing. I'm like, what the hell? I was like, what's he doing with that nurse? It was his wife. I didn't know that. And I had completely forgotten that we'd worked together. I don't even know if he remembered, but I remembered it. And I did this TAC bus for about 6 months. I loved it. Working in Manhattan South was where I learned. I never wanted to work in Manhattan. You couldn't pay me to work in Manhattan, even in ESU. Like you couldn't have paid me to go there. There were people I loved it. I was like, no, the traffic, the people, you can't get around. Like one time in EMS, a heart attack call comes in. We're on, let's say, 5-3 in Park. The call is on 5-4 in Park. So not knowing any better, I'm like, oh, whatever my unit was, oh, we'll take that. We're around the corner. Took us 35 minutes to go around the corner. I was shocked.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Sounds about Manhattan.
I was that, and it's funny because I remember that coach. I was like, how do people work down here? Like I was like, this is insane that it takes you 35 minutes to go around the block. Anyway, so like I said, I did that, thoroughly enjoyed that. That's where I kind of got to start dealing with ESU. There was an ESU cop who just died a couple of years ago. His name was Al Shepard.
Yeah,
and Al was a short guy. Al was about 5'8"-ish. But I remember Al because, a lot of times I saw Al, he had this shotgun. And, I was talking to him. I told him, well, I'm waiting to get called by the PD. And he was like, oh, okay, good. And I said, how long you been in ESU? We're chatting. And he was always friendly. Him and his partner, always friendly, nice guys. And, I remember one caper with him, and it was another caper where I was like, yep, I got to get into ESU somehow. And I'm not even a cop yet. Some cop called at 13 on 42nd Street because, again, anyone that was around back then, 42nd Street in the early 80s, probably from the 70s, was the biggest crap hole you could think of. It was just incredible. Like, it got a reputation with Julianne, the tourist spot. It was not the tourist spot back then. Like on 42nd Street, you would get people shot, like on 42nd Street, shot, stabbed, robbed. I was like, wow. So the one call I always remember is this cop calls at 13 at a pool hall. We responded because I was like, oh, maybe someone get hurt. I stayed in the background. I didn't like jump into it. But I remember rolling up, and I remember seeing it was Adam 1, Al Shepard pull up. They jump out with the shotguns. And I remember a mounted cop. Any mounted cop from back then that ever hears this has to remember this. They have to know this story. So here I am. I'm an EMS. I'm in the background minding my own business. I see Al Shepard pull up. I see the cops pull up. Here comes this mounted cop. Rides a horse down, rides through the crowd, and rides into this building. And I'm like, it's almost like watching a movie. I'm like, where's the popcorn? Like, I can't believe this. The pool hall's on the second floor. So he rode his horse upstairs into this pool hall, cleared out a bunch of people, and the horse comes down. And I'm like, I have to become a cop. I absolutely have to become a cop. Like, this is absolutely great. And I did that waiting for the phone call. And actually the first people that called me to become a cop was the New York State Police. And I get they didn't call. It was letters back then. There was no email and all that stuff. And I get a letter, and, you got to call up. And are you interested? I was like, yeah, I'm interested. So I remember going up to Albany, first time in Albany, one Saturday. Spent the entire Saturday up in Albany processing. And they did everything in one day because they knew, people were coming from a distance. So you leave, and they're like, okay, we'll get back to you. Investigate. You met my investigator the same day. And wasn't that much longer after, get a letter, you're accepted, you're in the next, state police academy. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, even though I took the test, I didn't really think I'd get called. Long story short, so I go into the New York State Police Academy, get sworn in up there. I was there for a very short time because friggin' 2 weeks after you get in there, the New York State Police Academy, like a lot of state police you live in. You're there from Sunday night until Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Like they own you. They tell you when to eat, sleep, whatever. And I wouldn't know until I got back home, letter from the NYPD to start processing. And I'm like, oh my God. So I call. You guys have Saturday appointments? Nope. Monday through Friday. So now I have a decision. Am I staying in the state police academy or am I leaving the state police? So I made the decision to leave. I don't regret it. At the time, the state police pay was atrocious, unlike today. I actually took a pay cut from EMS to go to the New York State Police. At EMS, I think I was making 14, 15 grand a year. The state police starting salary in 1981 was $13,000 and change. And I remember thinking to myself, wait a second, I'm going to go become a cop and I'm going to be making less money. I was like shocked. And the starting salary for the NYPD at the time was $17,949. I don't know why that number sticks in my head, but I wound up leaving the State Police Academy because I'm like, if I want the NYPD, I have to come down to process. So I come down. Around the time the NYPD calls me, the transit police call me, corrections calls me, and court officers. So I literally processed for all these jobs. Someone had told me, I met someone who was like, whoever calls you, go for it. You can always say no at the end. So I processed for all these jobs, which it turns out was a good thing. It's a good thing I didn't blow them off because, and I'm a believer in fate in the sense of, sometimes you have no control over what happens. Things happen. Long story short, I'm beside myself. I get the call to go to the NYPD. I go down to 20th Street to process. And at that time, didn't really drink, didn't smoke, didn't drink coffee. I sound boring. I just wasn't into any of those things. So I get in there, and it's so funny because I always say, I don't know why fate did this to me. It did it for whatever reason. If I had been processed first, I never would have been a transit cop. But because I wasn't in the first group, we're in the second group. So the cop that's grabbing people in says, all right, you guys got a couple hours to kill. You guys can go smoke, go have some coffee, don't go far. Okay. So I'm sitting there. I'm like, I don't smoke. I don't drink coffee. So he comes in again. Oh, you guys still got time. You're going to go have a cup of coffee. I don't know what happened in my head. I'm like, oh, let me go have some coffee. I didn't drink coffee. I didn't drink coffee at all. I have 2 cups of coffee. Think nothing of it. Long story short, when I go to start processing, I'm going through everything. I get to my medical. They check my blood pressure. The guy goes, oh, your blood pressure's a little high. I mean, my blood pressure's high. My blood pressure. He goes, yeah. And I remember it was 151 over like something. The cutoff was 150. If you were 150, you were good. If you were above 150, I was 151. I've never forgotten this. So what happens then is becomes psychological because you're like, what? And he goes like, oh, just sit down for a few minutes. They'll check it again in a few minutes. Of course, I'm sitting there a nervous wreck now. Like, why is my blood pressure up? I always said, pretty sure it was the coffee I just drank. I shouldn't have drank it. I didn't drink coffee. I should have had a damn glass of water. Long story short, I'm told, oh, you're on medical review. Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, oh, well, you got to come back. They'll call you, get your blood pressure checked. I'm like, okay. So I walk out of there in shock. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, I just left the State Police Academy. But the irony of this, and that's why I always say I knew it was the coffee, because I passed the transit medical. I passed the corrections medical. I passed everything. I've never had, any type of health issue like that. And long story short, thank God I did all that because I was on medical review. I didn't hear from the NYPD at all. Transit calls me. Oh, you'll be in the next class in January. Yes, I'll be in the next class. So I signed up to pay my rent. I still had the same apartment. I worked 1 month in Co-op City Security. A friend of mine was a lieutenant there. So I worked the job there 1 month, Back then, I think now a lot of them, I don't know if all of them are armed. Back then, very few of them were armed. They were special patrolmen. And it's funny because, you talk about a catalyst. One night I go out on a 4x to work. And, you worked in the buildings and walking around. And I'm with a guy. I don't remember his name. He's an older guy. And I'm talking to him. And he tells me he's a retired cop out of the 4-7. I said, oh, well, I said, oh, how long were you a cop? He said, did 20 years. And even though he wasn't armed, he was armed because he was like, I've been a cop. Because I'm not going to walk around. He had an ankle holster on. So I'm like, oh. So I remember talking to him, and he was telling me, he goes, yeah, and I've never forgotten this. He goes, I should have stayed longer than 20. He goes, it's 20-year pension. And he goes, biggest mistake I ever made was leaving. He'd been out for years. And I remember I'm 21 years old now, and I'm hearing this, and I'm like, what? And he's like, yeah. He goes, if you get on, he goes, enjoy yourself. And he goes, don't leave until. And I've never forgot what this man said. And I did that just for a month. It was just to make a salary for the month. And I wound up going into the Transit Police Academy, January 29th, 1982. And where was the Transit Police Academy I went to? Again, irony, 155th and 8th, the Polo Grounds.
Full circle.
I laughed because I'm like, that's where I was lost, on that corner right over there. And the other thing I forgot to mention when I was living in Harlem, one of the, something you never forget, and it ties into the Polo Grounds. I remember one Saturday night, I'm home and I start hearing sirens. And at that point, because I knew I wanted to be a cop, you could tell if it's a police car, an ambulance, a fire truck. I'm hearing sirens. So I look out the window and I can see 8th Avenue, and I see police cars flying north on 8th Avenue, but they wouldn't stop. Marked cars, unmarked cars. I saw the ESU big truck. It was probably truck 2. I saw ESUR, this was nonstop. Again, that's before 24-hour news and the news cycle. But what had happened, that was the night that Pagentini and Jones were killed in the Polo Grounds, in the front of the Polo Grounds by the BLM. And, again, like I said, I wasn't a street kid, so it wasn't like I could go out and see what was going on. I didn't know until 11 o'clock that news that night and the next day. And here I am, like I said, little did I know, it was 9 years later, my academy, the Transit Academy, was in an old school right in front of the Polo Grounds, because Transit used to hire 200 or 300 people at a time. But because the subway system from the fiscal crisis had been left to their own devices, the subways were a madhouse. Like what they're complaining about today is nothing. And the class before us was the first class to ride the subways in 6 years. And the class before us was about 600 people, and my class was 600. Transit didn't hire 600 people, and all of us were going to ride the trains. And I say this now because, like I said, I had no intentions of becoming a transit cop, and it was a different job. I would not have stayed there if, let's say, the NYPD had never called me. I wouldn't have stayed there. I don't want to spend, my career being a transit cop. And the irony of that is, and I say that only because, you know what you want. I like being outside, and I say that because the irony is I spent a year and a half, the 6 months in the academy, a year on the street. Probably, I can't even put into words how invaluable being a transit cop was to being an NYPD cop. And I'm not knocking transit, I'm not knocking the NYPD, but I'm going to say this, and I remember saying this to people then. They were like, what? And I was like, let me tell you something. I said, after spending a year as a transit cop, there's nothing the NYPD could throw at you can't handle. Because as a transit cop, you were by yourself.
And the radio sucked.
You were by yourself. You had this big-ass radio that worked when it felt like it. I used to tell people this, and they didn't believe me, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you this. You see where I am right now? I'm sitting in my kitchen. Mm-hmm. You could pick up your radio as a transit cop and call a dispatcher, and the dispatcher wouldn't hear you. You could turn sideways and call a dispatcher and hear you crystal clear. I knew about radios. I immersed myself in this whole emergency response thing, so I understood radios. But I was stunned that you're telling me that if I'm standing here, you can't get me. But if I take one step, it's like a kid's game. Take one step to the left. Crystal clear. So that's what you dealt with as a transit cop. And the class before us, we thought we had it bad, but I think the class before us had it worse because they were the first cops riding the trains in 6 years. And the subways in the early 80s were the definition of the Wild Wild West. It was a madhouse. I think back to my time there, and I'm like, if I didn't experience this myself, I wouldn't believe the stuff that that you deal with there. And like I said, didn't matter whether you were male or female, you worked by yourself, and made a lot of good friends. I mean, I was thinking about him last night. Being there, being a transit cop out in the streets taught me so much about being a cop, about dealing with people, about, the whole cop family, if you want to call it that. The academy wasn't bad. I had a good time. I broke my ankle in the academy doing role playing one time. I didn't miss a day. Broken on a Friday, and I was back in there hobbling around and crutches and a cane on Monday. But and they weren't bad in the academy. They had great instructors. And out in the street, we had 3 sergeants. And I'm only going to mention the good guy. He passed away about 9 years ago. His name was Frank Piscani. He was one of our sergeants. We're all brand new cops. And there were 2 other sergeants. One of them was a prick. There's no nice way to put it. He actively tried to screw people. He actually got one of our class fired, which stunned me. I was like, how do you get a rookie cop like for nonsense? Like, he didn't actually even like do anything. Like, he just like, oh, he didn't sign out, and he wound up getting fired. And I was stunned by it. I was like, is there another story here? So that was one. And then the other guy, I'm not going to mention his name either. He was a follower. If he was working with the prick, he was a prick. When he worked with Piscani, he was a nice guy. Piscani, who became a personal friend, the house I'm in used to belong to a friend of mine. Piscani used to come in. We used to have get-togethers here on the weekends. What a gentleman. What a nice man. I was so sorry. He lived to be, I think, about 73. I was so sorry to hear when he passed away. I heard about it afterwards. But he was the guy that taught me, like, I was never a boss, but he taught me that, okay, to be an effective boss, you don't have to be a prick. You just don't have to be. It's a decision. It's a choice. And him in my squad, Harry Scott, Harvey Jones.
Harry Scott. He was on Cops. He was on
Harry,
episode of Cops.
Harry was on Cops. Harry was one of my guys in my academy class, and we worked together. Harry, Harvey, Yves Armand, who left to the NYPD before me or after me, but he worked out of the 2-4 till he retired. Joe Lopez. We were very tight. When I tell you we got involved in all kinds of stuff, like stuff bled over, so to speak. Obviously I made my first arrest. Like, my first arrest is nothing to brag about. You could never forget it. 3 o'clock in the morning, we get called to a subway station, 138 on the 6th, I think. And it's a booth clerk. She says, a guy exposing himself. In my head, I'm like, okay, 3 o'clock in the morning. We go into a subway station. There's no one there. It's the booth clerk, us, and this guy. And he's standing there like he didn't move. And what he actually did was he stood in front of the booth and jerked off in front of this clerk. And
As
just
you
stood
do.
there. And I said to myself, it's funny, I said to myself, and this was it, that was at the very beginning of my police career. I said to myself, wait, what? Like, he did what? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm not going to stay on this job. This is not for me. I was like, this is crazy. So, I wound up locking him. He's my first, I don't know his name, but he's my first collar. And I made my first gun collar as a transit cop. And, I didn't know. That became my specialty. But my first gun collar was one night at 3 o'clock in the morning in the 4-1. Like, I worked out of District 12, which was at 180th Street. And District 12, the 5 and the 2 line passed it, but we covered the 6. But there were places down south where they met. So if you were assigned to ride the 6 train, sometimes depending on the hours, you would get off at Hunts Point by Brooklyn Boulevard, and we'd walk Southern Boulevard 2 blocks to get to Westchester to get on the number 2, which took us to the district. So one night, there's like 4 or 5 of us, uniformed cops, walking down Southern Boulevard at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we see like three people coming at us. And we're all getting closer. I don't think anything. It's just 3 people. We're all walking, chatting. All of a sudden, when these guys, I don't know why, I'm assuming they were probably on something. I don't think they realized we were cops, which I didn't get. We were in uniform, nightsticks, hats. I don't think they realized we were cops until we were very close to them. All of a sudden, they duck into a building. So we're all like, did you see that? We're all going. They can't get in. What are you guys doing? You guys live here? They don't live here. Why are you guys running in here? We're talking to them. Gave them a quick toss. I didn't toss them. Other cops did. And I'm like, okay, well, you don't live here. Get out of here. Send them out. One guy leaves. The other guy leaves. So the cops walk out. So I'm in this hallway now with this one, I call him a kid. He was 16. And I'm looking at him, and the only thing I notice about him, and I'll pat myself on the back for it in the sense of, I guess I developed an eye for this stuff, is I just noticed he wasn't standing up straight. So I said to him, like, something wrong with you? And he's like, no. I said, so, get out of here. And he was kind of waiting for me to go out first. And I said, why aren't you standing up? I said, you sick or something? He's like, no. So I realized he's not standing up straight. So these other cops had tossed him. I saw these other two cops tossed him. So I said to him, why can't you stand up straight? Like, he looked like a healthy young man. So when I grabbed his shoulder to stand him up, what happened was he had a gun on him. How the other cops missed it, I have no idea. That's the kind of thing that could turn into like a tragedy. And when I stood him up, the gun rolls down his leg. And it's funny. That was the first, not the last time I ever heard the sound of a gun hitting a New York City marble hallway, which is such a distinctive sound. Any experienced cop, like, you could drop a gun on the 5th floor and a cop on the ground floor would say that was a gun that hit the ground. So I step on it. I cuff him. It's a real gun. It's a Saturday Night Special. And I cuff him and I step out. Now, the guys I'm with, they're a half a block. And I'm like, hey, I'm trying to get them on the radio. Didn't work. So I finally have to yell. They turn around. And I'm like, they're like, what? And I was like, come back. I was like, this guy has a gun. They're like, they thought I was joking. But, that was my first gun collar. And, I made a few others in transit. Had a few crazy capers there. I mean, the worst thing that happened in transit. I mean, I had some, part of transit back then, which I don't think city cops experienced this. You fought regularly. Like, I'm talking physical fights with people, because, like, you could stop 10 people and 8 of them will cooperate. There's 2 people that want to fight. And you'd get into fights. It was just part of the job. And, one night I had a guy for summons, and we were assigned to ride trains. You had to write down the front car number. That's how they check to make sure you were where you were. So I get off at 125th and Lex with my summons. Unbeknownst to me, my best friend at the time, Joey Rosari, he'd gotten off there also because he had a summons. He was on the train in front of me, because they didn't want 2 cops on the same train, because they're like, well, if you're on the train together, your train's empty, so you get into trouble for it. So we finish up our summonses, and the way that worked is, you at some point, you got to go down to 42nd Street and catch up with your train, your northbound train. So I'm talking to Joe, and this is one of those things that just, really opened my eye up about this job. I'm talking to him. I'd been at this house on the weekend, and he gets on this train. I was like, all right, I'll see you down at 42nd Street or, up north later on. He gets on his train. I'm waiting to get on my train. Before my train gets into the station now, this man, Joe, had literally just left me, 90 seconds ago? I hear him on the radio, calling it 13. So I know he's on this train. This is the thing about transit. There's points where there's nothing you could do. I hear him calling at 13. Like, what the? So the thing about that is, well, I can't get on this train because this train's never going to catch up to that train. Next thing I hear him on the radio, and it's broken up, calling shots fired. And I'm like, this is within 90 seconds or 2 minutes of him leaving me. I am like, oh my God. So now I start running up the stairs. I'm like, I'm going to commandeer a cab or something to go down Lexington Avenue. I'm at 125 in Lex, and I get upstairs. By this time, now I hear him on the radio. I hear him saying he shot. I hear him saying the purpose shot. And I'm like, I just can't believe it. The other thing about transit back then, which is terrible, they only had 2 cars out on patrol for a district, which was insane. Like, that just, to me, that's just insane. Even back then, that's just so irresponsible. Only 2 cars out. Like,
I think just them and EMRU, right?
Well, they had an EMRU, but I'm saying for the actual district patrol cars, there were 2 cars. Like, District 12 covered the West Bronx. Mm-hmm. There's several train lines. I'm sorry, the East Bronx and East Bronx. There were only 2 patrol cars to cover every district. So when I get upstairs, I'm looking for a cab. I see a housing car. Flag him down, tell him, listen, one of our cops called at 13, he's shot. So they start heading down Lex. And, they tell their dispatch what's going on. They're like, where is it? I'm like, we're trying to get the location. He winds up, because it was an express train. I left, this started, well, I was at 125. He winds up, the train's next stop is 59th Street, 59 and Lex. So we get down to 59 and Lex. It was ironic because 59 and Lex, if you've been there, that's the station that's really, really deep. I forget how deep it is. I actually got there before they bought him out. I wound up in the newspaper only because as I was going down as they were bringing him up, and I helped carry him to the ambulance and snapped the picture and wound up in the paper with it. But he had been shot. He was shot. Joe was shot in the shoulder, and he had a couple of bullets grazed his head. Missed getting killed by millimeters. And it's funny because this was another thing about transit back then is, told us if you're smart, you'll carry 2 guns. And so you started carrying 2 guns, always carried a nightstick and 2 guns. And what had happened was, this was, again, the whole crack angel dust era. He gets on a train, there's a guy smoking. Like you see a newspaper story, say, oh, cop shoot smoker. No, a cop didn't shoot a smoker. A cop shot a guy that tried to kill the cop.
Exactly.
And, what had happened was he's writing the guy's summons. The guy attacks him. The guy actually gets his gun, gets Joe's gun. And Joe realizes this guy has my gun. And Joe's telling the guy, listen, take it easy, take it easy. And what the guy doesn't realize is as Joe's telling him to take it easy, thank God he's reaching for his other gun. And the guy didn't realize Joe had a gun until he saw it, another gun. And they basically stood face to face, trading shots with each other. Joe shot him, didn't kill him, but Joe shot him, but he, just about almost killed Joe. Now, another small world type of thing. The first person to come and help Joe was an off-duty cop on his way to work. And who was that off-duty cop? Tom Purtell, future Chief
right.
Purtell. That's when I met him. I think I met him during processing, and then we met that night, and he was on his way into Midtown South from midnight, and he was on the train. He was the first person to get to Joe to help him out and, take this perp into custody. But, that, like I said, that was, for us, for our little group, I'm trying to think. I don't think anyone else in the group had been involved in a shooting. We've had a couple people throw shots at us. It was just crazy back then. There was one of our guys, and I can't remember his name. Guy was just a regular guy, regular cop, rookie cop. He comes into work to sign out, at the end of the tour. And as he's walking away, the desk officer says to him, hey, what is that on your back? What are you talking about? He goes, come here. Comes over. This is inside of District 12. And what was on his back was a bullet. Someone had shot him, and he had no idea he was shot. Like there's a bullet, there's a hole in his shirt, and there's a bullet lodged in his bulletproof vest. He had no idea he was shot. Huh?
How did he not know?
Probably a small caliber bullet. And he had, and the other thing, the subways are so noisy, you're not going to hear gunshots.
That's true.
But he took a round in his back, had no idea. And, they took him to the hospital. They couldn't really investigate it because he had no idea what happened. But long story short, he quit. That was his last night. He could not wrap his head around the fact that someone shot him. Like I had no incidents with anybody, and he quit. He after he got out of the hospital, he came back. He turned in his shield and he left. And they're like, "What are you doing?" He was like, "Nope." He was like, "This job is not for me," and he left. He wound up leaving. It's funny with a story like that. I mean, I'll tell you right now. Years later, I'm in ESU. I've been in ESU for a while. Jimmy Derby, who was a cop in one truck, and I laugh. 2 incidents like this. There was a job downtown one night where Chief Anamone was there. Barricade turned into a shooting, but Jimmy Derby was on this job. I was moving a shield, and Jimmy Derby took a hit in the vest, but an ESU vest. Jimmy had no idea he took a hit because the perp let loose rounds. The precinct cop did. Jimmy found out the next day when he was at one truck. I think he was going to court or something. And he says, I was talking to Jimmy, and he says, I'm moving my vest. And I look at my vest. And I go, what the hell is that? Bullet lodged in his vest. They had to call crime scene. Crime scene had to come to one truck to voucher it, had to get the DA or anything. But anyway, with transit, like I said, I did that for a year. And then in, I think it was late July, August of '83 was when I rolled into the NYPD. And it's funny, like I said, I wound up a medical review. In that year and a half, never heard from the NYPD. Never heard from them, and I was like, you want to know how I got this squared away? And if I'd known this, I wouldn't have spent all that time in transit, even though, like I said, it was a hell of a learning experience. One day I'm in Manhattan. I made a collar in Manhattan, which you tried to avoid because processing a collar in Manhattan was a freaking nightmare. But anyway, I'm near where they do the medical review. I forget the street, Worst Street. So in my head, I'm like, let me just stop in there and see what the deal is, why they haven't called me. I'm in uniform. So I'm heading for a train. I stop, I go into this building, I go, hey, how you doing? Oh, hey, what's going on? You know, I'm in uniform. So listen, I'm on medical review, and I said, I haven't heard from you guys. Oh, when have you? I said, I've been on medical review for about a year and a half. The guy goes, oh, what do you? And I explained to him. He goes, oh, finds my file. He goes, oh, I wish they would have done it then. He goes, oh, okay. He goes, when do you want to come in? I look at the guy like, what? I'm like, whenever. Come in like in 2 days. I go in, they take my blood pressure, you're fine. Boom. And I'm like, you mean to tell me all I had to do was come here in uniform like, 6 months ago? But that started it. And long story short, I rolled over with another cop, Eddie, and went to 20th Street for about a month to get, some like in-service training or stuff like that. I think we went to the range and wound up in NSU 8 in the Bronx out of the 4-3. Had a couple of great bosses there, some great FTOs. And it's funny because we didn't show up like the class, the NSU class got there in, I think, July. So we didn't show up, and me and Eddie didn't show up until September. So we didn't know this at the time. When we got there, they thought we were holdovers from the academy, which I didn't know this. So here we have these rookie cops making fun of us. And when I found this out, I was like, none of you guys are going to be detectives. I said, you can tell by like looking at our uniforms and our gear, like that it's not new. Like all I did was I didn't change my shirts. I changed the patches. And I was like, I kept the same gun belt. Everything was the same. And the guy's like, no, we thought you guys were holdovers. What did you say? I said, no, we were transit cops. They're like, oh, so you've done this stuff already. We were kind of laughing. So they were trying to tell us, oh, let me show you how to do the paperwork for, and I laughed. And I was like, I've been doing online bookings for the last year. But NSU was interesting, very good time. I had a couple of, again, I call it the small world thing. I seem to have a lot of this in my life. The sergeant there knew we came over from transit, Sergeant Signia, so I was his driver a lot of the times. And I remember coming into work one day for a 4x, and I saw something I'd never seen, and I literally have never seen still to this day. I see crime scene going northbound in the Bronx River, lights and siren. I'd never seen crime scene going anywhere, lights and siren. So I get in, I'm getting ready, and I'm driving the sergeant. I was like, I just saw a crime scene. And he goes, oh, there was a cop shot in the 4-5. And I was like, oh, okay. He tells me, yeah. He tells me it was an ESU cop. He's killed. And I'm like, oh, my God. So we get ready. We go out. We head up to the 4-5 over there by Westchester. And, the small world thing, because I go to the scene. I look at the scene, see what happened. And like little did I know that, I don't know if it was 10 years down the road, I'd wind up working with this dead ESU cop. It was Joe McCormick's father. Mm-hmm. And, at the time, I didn't know who it was. And I was just like, when that happened, I'm sorry to hear about a cop getting shot. Surprised with an ESU cop. But I spoke to Joe about it once. And I wasn't there when the actual shooting went down. I went by later on, and that's the thing about this job also is, when you work, depending on where you work, you just run into people and, run into things. And, that my NSU was a normal NSU. There were great FTOs there. The guy that sticks out with me, it's funny, Pat Flatley. He was the older FTO. And a lot of the rookies didn't like to work with him because they thought he was, too laid back, like too slow. And I laughed because Pat Flatley taught me things about being a cop that I carried. Yeah, Joe McCormick, that I carried my whole career. He was a great FTO. I had a great time there. And when I left, I didn't know anything about Bronx precincts. I was going to pick my precinct based on what's the busiest precinct. So, like I said, my time in NSU was, call it uneventful. I made a couple of gun collars there. I guess that became my thing. One notable thing that happened in ESU and NSU that made me laugh, where I kind of laughed, where I was like, wow, this is a lot different from transit. One day I was on a foot post on Leidig Avenue, and an old lady comes over and says, "Oh, officer, I came out to go to the store. When I went back to my apartment, the door was open." So I said, "You sure you didn't leave it open?" She's like, "No, I closed it. I locked it." She goes, "It's open." So I get her address. So I pick up the radio that worked, and I call the dispatcher and, tell them whatever post I was listening. And I tell them I have a female here who says she came home and found the door open. And all I said was, "Can you send me another car?" And the dispatcher's like, "Okay, 10-4." So I hear a unit answer up. But like in real time, I'm starting to hear sirens in the distance. And they're far away. Now, I don't realize they're coming to me, but I'm hearing more than one car, and they're getting closer and closer. This is all within seconds. So all of a sudden, like 3 radio cars. I'm like, Central, I just needed the one car, no further here. So I go and I'm telling the cops, like, I didn't, do anything wrong. I didn't ask for. He goes, no, it's all right. I'm like, okay. So we go and check. But I laugh because, like, the cop, I'm like, Jesus Christ, in transit, you could be screaming for your life and no one would hear you. Here I was, I just picked up a radio, and one time says, "Oh, can you send me one car?" And I wound up getting 4 cars. So that was kind of believe it or not, like the catalyst where I was like, okay, I'm not in transit anymore. And, this
is better.
is different. Like, when you call for help, you're going to get help. It's
Right.
rare that you wouldn't. And, during that time period, the NYPD was about to open the 4-9 precinct, but it was behind schedule. So to appease the public, the plan they came up with was to take all of us rookies and have us assigned to what was going to be the confines of the 4-9. And we did that via the Bronx Task Force. I wound up in the Bronx Task Force for a year. Had an interesting time there. Unfortunately, I got into a shooting incident there off duty one time. At the time, my girlfriend was a transit cop, and this is before direct deposit and all this stuff. And it was payday. I went to work at 6. She went in earlier, so she didn't have any money. So I said, "I'll go get my check and give you some money." So I go get my check. I go to cash it. As I pull up to cash it, I see like a dispute in the street. I look over it. I don't think too much of it. Go in, cash the check. Get ready to come out to drop her off at work. But when I come back out, the same dispute's still there. But I see a guy with a pretty big knife in his hand. I was like, "Oh, this guy stabbed someone." And I didn't, the department, they like to tell people, "Oh, cops are on duty 24 hours a day." They don't want you getting involved in minor stuff. And if you're smart, you wouldn't. But I always said, I'm not going to stand there and let someone get killed in front of me or stabbed in front of me, not do anything. So I'm watching this commotion. So I go to a phone, because this is before cell phones. I remember the date. I'm not going to say it, but I remember the date. But I go to the phone. I call the dispatcher, tell them what's going on. I said, "I might want to get a couple cars here." So she goes, "Okay, I'll make it an 85. I said, "Yeah, that's fine." So now this guy with the knife is getting more aggressive, and he's trying to stab a guy. So now I walk over to get involved. I have my off duty. I pull my shield. I go, "Listen, police." I go, "Put the knife down." So the guy looks at me, and I go, "Put the knife down." I didn't have my gun in my hand. I was a distance away from. I wasn't on top of the guy. And all of a sudden, the guy bolts. So my girlfriend tried to stop him, and he knocks her down because he took off. He was pretty big guy. I think it was my height or more. So I thought he had stabbed her. And like, again, this is all in the span of a couple of seconds. So now I'm running after him. And, I don't have a radio. No cell phone. I'm chasing him, telling him to stop. And I don't pull my gun out until I'm about to catch up to him because, he still had this friggin' knife in his hand. So I catch up to him, and we get into a struggle. And it's funny what you recall in stressful situations or traumatic situations, because I remember when I caught up to him, I grabbed him and he stopped to confront me, and I was worried about this knife, but he had dropped the knife, and we get into a fight. And again, most of what I'm telling you, some of it's my memory, but the rest of it is from witnesses. Because it's incredible what you don't process or what you don't recall immediately. And we get into a fight, and we're fighting. He's trying to grab my gun. And it's so funny because The one thing I remember from this day, which is just so surreal, is at one point I was looking down the barrel of my own gun, like he's trying to pull the trigger. And it's funny because the 38 bullets were lead bullets and they all had marks on them from, just banging around. And I remember looking down the barrel of my gun and seeing this friggin' bullet. And it's funny because the thought in my mind was, I can't believe I'm freaking get shot with my own friggin' gun. And I said a gun that I paid for. Long story short, we're in this fight. He gets the gun to go off. Thank God it's not pointed at me. It was pointed at him. And, I hate to say it, but he was dead before he hit the ground. I found out afterwards, that he was a local drug dealer and, a cop fighter. And what had happened was he had carjacked that car. And the people he carjacked it from followed him to get the car back. You would think if you carjacked the car and got away with it and the people come, you'd leave. He wanted the car back. And,
audacity.
That became obviously a big crime scene and everything. And, they send me to the hospital. I'm like, oh, I'm all right. And I'm like, no, you got to go anyway. And like, oh, and you got to get your neck looked at. I was like, why the hell do I have to get my neck looked at? He goes, you're bleeding. I go, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't realize this guy had his hand around my neck. And it sounds crazy. I didn't realize it. But he had his hand around my neck, I guess, trying to choke me. But I was more concerned about holding on to my gun. And he left his fingerprints in my neck. Like, he gouged out, 5 pieces of flesh out of my neck. And I didn't even realize that. And then, you have these people out there that think cops want to get into a shooting. No cop in their right mind, no cop that I ever knew wanted to get into a shooting because, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. But, it's out of work for a few days. You got to wait till the grand jury and all that crap. You do all of that stuff. So, that was, other than 9/11, probably the most traumatic thing I went through, like personally. And like I said, that was my time in the task force. That was probably around the beginning of my time there. The rest of my time there, I had, again, I didn't realize at the time that I was, into gun collars, but I was, I wound up once on a dead foot post, and I laughed because I wound up getting into a foot chase of a guy with a gun. You learn as you go along. And what had happened was I'd had a tow truck driver. It had started to snow, who was driving around on the sidewalk doing donuts, and he didn't see us standing there. So when I finally go over to him, I'm like, "What are you doing?" He gets testy with me. I gave him a summons, and about an hour later, I see him, and I was like, "Oh, this tow truck driver's back." He goes, "Listen, I'm sorry about before. I want to make it up to you." And I'm like, "You don't have to make anything." He goes, "No, I want to make it up to you." He goes, "Listen, you guys interested in grabbing someone with a gun?" I'm like, "Where?" So he says there's a dude, and he gives us the location, gives us the description, says he has a gun. I'm like, okay. So we call a car. We get a task force car. We're on White Plains and no, not White Plains. We're on Allerton in Boston. This was all the way up Boston by Eastchester, which is a good distance. So because it was a task, we go up there. Sure enough, we pull up, and I was like, oh, there's the guy. So there's 4 of us now. There's the 2 cops that were in the car and us on foot. So we get out. Foot chase. A couple guys scatter. I'm chasing the guy with the gun. I know he had a gun at the time. I'm chasing him, and those are like low garden type apartments. They're like projects, but they're not like 20-story projects. So I'm chasing this guy, and he's running through this maze, and I'm chasing him. And it gets to a point. This was something I learned, and pass it on to my son. And when you're chasing someone with a gun, if you lose sight of someone with a gun, it's not a good idea to blindly run around a corner, and it's not a good idea to just, you kind of want to open up a bit. So I had sight of him until he went around one corner. And when I realized he wasn't there, I stopped. So now I'm stopped. I have my gun out, and I'm looking like, where'd this guy go? And I'm looking, and where he went, it's one of those things where I was like, could have been a bad night for me. He was hiding behind some hedges with his gun in his hand. Kid was like 17 years old. And I'm like, 17 years old, you're prepared to shoot a cop. So I saw him before he saw me. So my gun's pointed at the bushes. I'm yelling at him. I'm shining a light. He finally drops the gun and comes out. And I laughed because my sergeant goes, "How did you make a gun collar up there when you?" And I explained to him. He's like, he made me laugh. He goes, you remind me of a guy that I used to work with. He goes, you guys find trouble no matter where it is. So I laughed. I was like, well, it is what it is. I did my time there, and our year's time came up, and they weren't really going to keep us. We were all going out to the precincts. And it's so funny how I wound up in the 4-6. I went to this sergeant. I can't remember his name. Seabold? Can't remember his name. I said, what's the busiest precinct in the Bronx? And he goes, oh, probably the 4-4. Then he goes, nah, the 4-6 is probably a little busy. I go, well, which is it? He goes, the 4-6. He goes, why? I go, that's where I want to go. Because they asked us, wherever you want. So he goes, wait, you want it? I said, yeah, that's the busiest. I would have gone to the 4-4 if he said so. That's how I wound up in the 4-6. And I wound up going to the 4-6 in December of 84. I think my partner and I had my partner, Al Bratton. I think we started making gun calls our third day on the street. And my time in the 4-6 was incredible. I think I made, I never kept a complete count, but I think in the time we were there, I think I grabbed probably about, I don't know, I'm going to say maybe 60 plus guns. And it was constant. I wasn't the only one doing this. There were people up there, Patty Brosnan, Walsh, Gilday, Howard, Solis, Mahonis. We were the gun guys. Like what we used to do it sounds crazy. What we did on a swing, when you came back from a swing, was we actually come in and went to the gun locker to see what guns came in while we were off, or if any guns came in. And I mean, I'm proud to say it now, but the 4-6 property lock was always full of guns back then. And I would say 90%, 95% came from just this small core group of guys. That was just our thing. And the cops in the 4-6 were phenomenal. The men, the women, they were absolutely phenomenal back then. And I think about it, sometimes you hear, I mean, I don't know if you hear it so much now, some guys just knock female cops. And I'm like, listen, there are female cops on the job that shouldn't be on the job. But I used to tell people, I can also point out men that have no business on the job also. But the women back in the 4-6 back then they were very, very, very good cops. They would mix it up with you. I mean, I had physical fights with people with guns where the female cops, Nashma Suleiman, Alice Delaney, Juliana, Denise Davis, they were just people that were there that just, they were great. And I mean, like I said, my thing was gun collars. Back in those days, I think you've heard it from some other people. The NYPD, which was incredible, didn't want patrol cops making gun collars. I mean, drug collars.
Yeah, because of the whole NAP stuff and Sturbico, that era.
The 4-6 precinct, I went there in 84, was an open air drug market. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Like I compare what's going on today. While what's going on today is bad compared to how it's been, it was an open air drug mart. Like every block, every time you turned around. So the guys that I mentioned, that we were the guys looking for guns. We were more concerned with getting the guns to get the guns off the street to prevent shootings. And I mean, I'll tell you one story. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the Bronx. I'm a history buff. I'm a big history buff. And the Grand Concourse back in the 30s and 40s, only rich people lived on the Grand Concourse. There were no poor people on the Grand Concourse. You had to be rich to live there. Like 161 in the Concourse, that big building used to be the hotel that Babe Ruth and the Yankees used to live in. This is up right at the 4446 border. It's a big building. I forget the name of the building. Used to be one of these luxury apartments. One night we get a call there for a dispute. I go there with Patty Brosnan, Walsh, with Al Bratton and Lieutenant McGinnis. And we go there. Now, I'd been in the building, but I guess I wasn't paying attention. I did not realize that the apartments had more than one entrance. And this goes back to the era of when it was a rich area. So we start knocking on what we think is the front door because we listened. We heard some kind of commotion going on. We knock. Someone comes to the friggin' peephole, looks. They scurry off. We're knocking. Police, open the door. All of a sudden, we hear a commotion like around the corner from us. There was a back door. We were at the back door. They came out the front door, but there was no place to go. They were in a hallway. They couldn't get by us. So big fight breaks out. We pushed these guys back in the apartment. There's 3 guys. One guy had a shotgun, get into a big fight with him. And 6 of us there, all 6 of us were involved in this. Well, the guy with the shotgun, we were struggling with. The shotgun goes off in the struggle. And of course, when that happens, you don't want to, we are worried about a cop getting hit. So this thing goes off, and, the sound a shotgun makes going off in an apartment sounds like a bomb. This shotgun blew a hole in the wall and moved the refrigerator off the wall about 4 feet into. I was like, okay. So we get them into custody, recovered the shotgun, a couple of handguns, drugs, guns. And I was like, Jesus Christ. I was like, can you imagine? I said, probably would have killed one of us if this thing would have hit us, or, taking your leg or arm off. That was one of the crazy capers. Another one was one of them with Al Bratton, and we're going down Creston Avenue. Minding our own business, just a rainy night, a little busy. And we're actually on our way to a job, and we see a guy who's playing lookout. And we see him out of the corner of our eye. We don't really let him know that we see him. So we're like, did you see that? Yeah. So we go around the block, come back. I was driving. I parked on the sidewalk up against the building. Had the lights off and everything, the headlights off. So we hop out of the car and we scurry up to this building. We see this guy looking out. And he's looking out, but he doesn't realize we're up against the wall. As soon as we get there, we saw him looking out. It wasn't just him looking out. It looked like a dozen guys in this little hallway. So we run in, so everybody hands up. We smell marijuana, so they're in there smoking. What's going on? We had no idea what it was. So apparently they were in there gambling and smoking weed. So you got a small vestibule with a locked door on the other end. So my partner goes to the top so no one can get in, even though you couldn't get in. And I'm at the bottom. It's like 5 steps. So there's 5 guys on this wall, 5 guys on that wall. Toss the first guy, he's got a gun. Take the gun out, cuff him up. Toss the second guy. Now, we never called for any backup or anything because I didn't know what the hell this was. We toss the second guy, and I'm doing the tossing. He's got a gun. So I'm like, okay. Third guy, no gun. Fourth guy, he's got a gun. So now we're up to 3 guns. Now we call for backup. I said, send us a couple of units over here. We gave him the address. So I jokingly, because, I didn't get flustered by these things. I jokingly go, oh, must be gun night in the 4th Does anybody else have a gun? And a guy on the opposite wall raises his hand. So now I look around. I'm like, what? So I go to him, and sure enough, he has a gun. I'm like, I'll be a son of a gun. So those were the 4. So I was like, Jesus Christ, we were just driving by, wind up with 4 guns, and of course, no one had a permit for it. They were just people walking around with guns. And that was one. And it's funny because probably a year later, literally right around the corner from there, one of the things that used to happen back, I don't know if it still happens, they used to keep you for 4 hours overtime at the end of your 4x. It was busy. So I'm like, yeah, I never turned down overtime. So my partner couldn't stay. So I wound up taking this 4 hours with another cop. I knew who he was. He wasn't a ball of fire. He would never have been my partner. And I'm not even going to say his name, but, we have our busy 4 hours. So at about 3 o'clock in the morning, it's so busy, you're getting jobs by yourself. There's no backup. They give us a 30, which is a robbery in progress with a gun in the lobby. Okay. So I roll up. Don't pull up to the building. I park. I get out. I'm walking towards this building. My partner's following me. And I look, and this is the kind of thing like you see in movies. I look, and sure enough, in the building, there's a guy like this, and there's a guy with a gun on him. And I'm like, oh, it's an actual robbery in progress. So neither one of them, the bad guy or the victim, saw us until it was too late for them. So there was a big hedge in front of this building. So I go up. And as soon as the guy sees me, the bad guy, I go, put the gun down. I reach for the door, thinking it's going to be open. The door's locked. I'm only 5 feet away from them, but they're behind the locked door. The victim never moves. The perp still has his gun on him. I was tempted to shoot through the glass. What made me not shoot through it was 38s. 38s are not a very reliable weapon. What my partner did was, backed out and called a 13, which I didn't ask him to. I was like, we don't need a 13. So now I'm dealing with this guy, and I'm telling the guy, put the gun down. But the robber, who I knew was experienced, wouldn't move. Like, he didn't point the gun. If he pointed the gun at me, I would have started shooting. But he didn't point the gun at me, but he won't put the gun down. So I'm like, open this door, and I'm yanking, I'm hitting the bells, nothing. And I'm just waiting to hear someone buzz the door. So I tell the victim now, this is crazy because this is going on in this little, I go, open this door. So he's like, the guy has a gun on me. I go, just reach out, because that's how close. So he reaches out, and it's funny. This shows you how smart perps are. As soon as the victim touched the door and it opened, the robber dropped his gun. I was like, you son of a gun. So, I thought he was going to run into the building, wound up collaring him. I actually gave the collar to the, I'll call him the scared cop. I gave it to him. I was so annoyed at his performance. I was like, here, you take it. And I just, I went on my merry way. But, again, like I said, the time there, taught me, Jesus Christ, if you could mix my short time in the 4-6 and my time in transit together, I'd say if this could be a blueprint for every cop. I mean, I actively went out looking for people with guns. That was my thing. And, a lot of the guys that I work with went on to be detectives. I mean, they were some of the best street cops. And I obviously, we weren't the only precinct like that. They were some of the best street cops you could ever run into. And the thing in the 4-6 that always used to amaze us, I was like, how come nobody decides to shoot it out with it? Because it was rare that we ever had to fire a gun. It was like non-existent. And I was like, I can't believe we're running into all these guns and nobody's willing to shoot it out with us. And we noticed something once that one time we heard about a shooting in Brooklyn, and there was a shootout with the cops. And I don't remember if a cop got shot. He might have, but I think a cop got shot. And we're reading the story, and where does the perp live? 4-6 precinct. Okay, little note. So a couple months later, we see another shooting in another borough with the cops. Where's the perp live? 4-6 precinct. I'm like, oh God, like, we have all these guys in our precincts that are willing to shoot it out with cops, but apparently they didn't want to shoot it out with us, which I was like, okay, they must be practicing that, you don't crap where you eat rule. And then another caper, which this is another one of those crazy capers, was one Sunday night in Yonkers, but on the Sawmill River Parkway, a Westchester County cop was shot and killed. His name was Gary Stimolowski. I always remember his name. And what had happened was, he was on regular patrol. Westchester County had one-man cars patrol the parkways, and he stopped the car for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, the bad guy got the drop on him, shoots him in the head, pushes the cop body over in the radio car and drives the radio car off the parkway. Puts it in Yonkers, about 3 blocks away from. I was familiar with Yonkers from my ambulance days, so he drove it a couple blocks and made a left. So now when the county is calling, the car was Sam 1, I think was the unit number. They're not getting an answer. They send another car. No sign of him. So now they call Yonkers. So there's a search going on for this cop. They found him about a half hour later. Actually, a Yonkers car finally saw this county car, goes up. He's shot in the head. I don't know if he was dead then, but he wound up dying. Long story short, or shorter, where does the perp live? 4-6 precinct up on 181st Street. He's a mechanic. Actually, some cops in the precinct that, used him. His name was Alex Mengel, I think. So now you have this cop shot and killed in his radio car. The perp is missing. So, they ID him. There's a manhunt to find this guy. Can't find this guy. He's missing for about a week. And where, there's, stakeouts by where he lives and everything, and, stuff going on in the background to find him, can't find him. So we're, of course, looking around. We were told to stay away from the area and mark cars so much because there's, a lot of undercover people over there. About a week later, he's found. And where is he found? Trying to cross into Canada at the Canadian border. And he's dressed like a woman. He's wearing lipstick, makeup, and he has a wig on. Canadian border guard. I don't know if you've ever been to Canada, but when you go to Canada, you can't just drive in. You got to present papers. Right. They ask you questions. Obviously, they grab him and don't realize right away who he is. So when they find him, okay, here's this guy. So we're like, oh God, he made it up to Canada. So They take him into custody up there, and he's got to work his way back downstate. In the meantime, and I lived at the time. I still lived in Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon, even though it's a city, is like a small town. A lot of people know each other. You see people. So there's a story that comes up about a missing woman. And when I see her picture in the paper, I realize I know the woman. And her name was Beverly. I can't remember her last name. I only knew her because I went to school with her daughter. She was a very unique woman in the sense she was short. She was about 5 feet tall, maybe 4'11", and she always wore heels, always dressed nice. But the thing about her was, the noticeable thing was she had long hair. She had hair down to her rear end. And I've seen her for years, and I knew her daughter. So I'm like, oh my God, like she's missing. Come to find out, she works in Yonkers along the Sawmill River Parkway. Apparently, this Mengel character, after he shot this cop, must have gotten back to the parkway because it's woody, and he spent a couple days in the woods over there. Apparently, at some point, he saw her, probably coming into work, pops out of the wood, kills her, steals her money, her car. And the wig he was wearing was not a wig. He scalped her. And I've never forgotten this story because, like I said, I didn't know him, but I knew her. But he had scalped her. And I was like, she had hair down to her rear end. And this man, here's a guy, like I said, he's from the 4-6 precinct, 181st Street by Aqueduct. Scalped her. And I'm like, they found her body in the woods by her job. I'm like, so this man scalped this woman. This is what, 1985, 86-ish? Scalps her and drives with her scalp up towards Canada, trying to get into Canada. The good thing about this story, the only good thing is, when the state police were transporting him, he gets into some sort of fight with the troopers, and I don't know if he tried to take a trooper's gun, but he wound up getting killed in the back of a state police car. That's the only good part about the story.
Yeah, good.
And, like I said, my 4-6 time was good. I mean, I like I said, gun collars, I didn't write up a lot of gun calls until we got an XO, Joe Leak. He was probably the first black captain I think I'd ever seen. And he comes to the 4-6 and, nice guy, gentleman. And after a week, he used to call me Mr. Johnson. He goes, oh, Mr. Johnson. He goes, I see you make a lot of gun calls. Yeah, so that's kind of my thing. So he goes, how come you don't write them up? And I was like, am I supposed to write them up? He goes, everyone else does. So I didn't know this. I go, really? He goes, yeah. And he goes, write them up. They're good for points on a test, blah, blah, blah. So I can only go back a year. So a lot of my early calls I couldn't, but I wrote up a bunch of them, got a bunch of medals because of him. And I mentioned him because he's how I got into ESU. One Sunday he has the duty, and, I had a partner, but he says, oh, I have the duty tonight, so I want you to drive me. I'm like, okay. So we spend the 4 to 12 driving around the Bronx. And at the end of the night, he says to me, well, what are you looking to do? Are you going to, keep chasing people with guns? Which I laugh. I was like, yeah, I enjoy that, and he goes, well, you want to be a detective? And I go, no. And I didn't. I didn't want to be a detective. So long story short, I go, I've been thinking about going to highway. I like motorcycles. He goes, I could have you on highway by the end of the week. And I was like, you could? I didn't know any better. So he goes, yeah. He goes, well, if you want to do that, let me know. So we're driving. So I look over, and it was a Sunday evening. I'll never forget that. And I said, where I really want to go is ESU. But I said, I know it's not a chance. He goes, well, which is it? I go, no, I want to go to ESU. And he said to me, he goes, oh, well, Ray Abruzzi, who was the CEO of ESU, Ray Abruzzi is always asking. And I'm sitting there like, what? And that was a Sunday. On Monday afternoon, I got a phone call at my house from ESU about putting in an application. I put in my application and, went through the processing, through psychological, some other stuff, and wound up, that's how I got into ESU. I wasn't in there like the next week, but I was in for the next class. I went in there in March of 87. It's so funny, like, how transfers come up. I put in for it, I was waiting for it. And what happened was I'm working a Friday 4-by, and I think I'm due to work Saturday, maybe Saturday and Sunday. I work my 4-by. I come back into quarters, into the 4-6 around 11 o'clock. And they're like, oh, Johnson, congratulations. What? you transferred to ESU. And I thought someone was messing with me, but, sure enough, Monday morning, I was in ESU, and, that's where I spent the rest of my career, loved it. And, when I went into ESU in 87, STS was 4 months. I think the guys before me was 2 months. I think they were up to 7 or 8 months or something like that. I know it's longer than the academy, but
it's 9. Now it's 9.
Yeah, it was a bit surreal for me. And I mean, STS for me was Sergeant Riley ran it, was phenomenal. I've told my kids this and some friends sometimes when you talk to people. I said, when you get out of ESU STS, you feel like MacGyver. I was like, because if you didn't know certain things, by the time you get out of there, they literally teach you to do just about everything. I mean, out of everything they taught me, and they taught me a lot, the thing that I was like most impressed by said lock picking. Was it Carl Russo, I think, from Six Truck was a locksmith, and he decided he wanted to introduce lock picking, and I was like, okay. And I was like, I've only seen that in movies. You mean you can really pick locks? And sure enough. And I was like, so now when you go on a job, instead of, breaking a door or breaking a lock, you pick locks. But I laughed because when I bought my house, I think the first week I bought my house, I locked myself out of my house. So it's your house. So I have a choice now. Am I going to break something to get in? And I went, oh, lock picks. So I got my lock picks and I got into my house thanks to, ESU without causing any damage. But I enjoyed my STS was good. And I laugh. I'll tell you this real quick. My initial, and ESU really is the only place I ever wanted to work. My initial few months in ESU was not pleasant. I wound up going to 3 Truck, and 3 Truck had a name back then. The House of Strangers was called, and we laughed. I didn't know, what that was about. And I went in with John DeLara from the 4-6, because John was a cop in the 4-6 with us. When we were there, and I found out he knew my partner, Al Bratton. John used to be a gym teacher in school. And John was a good guy. So John was in my STS class. John wound up going to 2 Truck. And me and Doug go to 3 Truck. And I laughed. Should have warned me. When you transfer into someplace new, you're starting all over again. In the 4-6, I had seniority, I was an experienced cop. I'm come to ESU. I'm a new guy. I had no problems with that. I'm like, I'm new to this world. So we finish up our STS. Like today, you were at the recent ESU STS graduation ceremony. I kind of chuckle when I see that. They've been doing that for a while. You know how we know what happened with us? Friday, we came in. They gave us some certificates. See you later. Goodbye. That was it. You left.
Get out.
So, Doug Bertrand and I stopped at 3 Truck on the way up because we're due up there Monday to see if we could find lockers. And this guy, I'm not even going to say his name, comes, what is it? I'm like, oh, we're in ESU uniforms now. We just graduated STS, and we came to see if there's any lockers. We were starting there Monday. So he says to us, when are you starting here Monday? And he goes, come back Monday. He slammed the door in our face. And I look at Doug and I go, like, is this a joke? And I said to myself, oh, my God. So we left. We left. It's like, what the hell was that all about? Come back Monday. And I'll say this now. Like I said, I won't mention any names. Anybody was around back then. My first few months in ESU were a friggin' nightmare. And they were a nightmare because of who I was working with. And it wasn't a nightmare for other people. There were a lot of old timers in the unit that were great. In 3 Truck at the time, Ronnie Zuba, Manny Hernandez, John Pladel, and one of my favorites, Ron Hareed, who passed away from cancer. They were old timers, great guys. I got stuck in a squad with someone who, whether he didn't like me or whatever, who made my time there a nightmare. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this, and I have no problem saying this. I worked with this man for 4 months. I learned nothing from him. Absolutely, and I'm not exaggerating, nothing. And it was so bad to the point, like, I'd work a whole tour with this guy, and he wouldn't say a word to me. And I started saying to myself, okay, did I make the right choice? Like, I just left the precinct where I was, I had good seniority, good vacation pay. And I seriously thought about going back to the 4-6. And it's funny because what made me not do it was the XO at the time, Captain, Jesus Christ, I can't remember his name now. Nice guy. He's working it one night. He comes in. I guess, yeah, I knew people had heard about my experience, and they were like, just a lot. I was like, why was I put into this squad with this guy? So he says to me, how's it going? I'm like, and he goes, yeah, this is a hard place to work. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to say too much because, again, I'm the new guy. So he goes, listen, we're going to be opening up Ford Truck. And that had been a rumor. And he said, he goes, another couple months. He goes, hang on, don't go anywhere. And I was like, okay, Cap. And I says, well, if you're going to open up Ford Truck, you can put my name on the list. And, when they finally made the announcement, I went. I think Ford Truck opened up with 16 people back then. And that, without a doubt, my time in Ford Truck was spectacular. Great group of people. The first sergeants up there was Sergeant Nolan and another sergeant who I'm not going to mention his name, but that's beside the point. But we started out with a small group of people. We had no big truck. We barely had enough equipment. We had enough equipment to load up a good Adam car, some for the boy car, and Ford Truck was the West Bronx, still is. And the West Bronx was the busiest side of the Bronx. And my God, I'm not going to, but I mean, I could literally talk for another 3 or 4 hours about all the stuff there. I mean, I learned, the thing about Ford Truck that I loved about it was you got every type of job. We had so many barricades, gun jobs, EDP jobs, jumpers. We had so many pin jobs. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I became, not only me, like an expert with Hearst tools. I mean, we had not door jobs, but I mean legitimate pin jobs where you're going to be there cutting this car apart for a half hour or more to try to get someone out. I mean, some of the memorable ones was, you're familiar with the Bronx Zoo?
Yeah, been there.
Well, Fordham Road, where it dips down, we used to call that Pin Alley. And we called it Pin Alley because every time it rained, there was a horrendous pin job there until they put those dividers in. And I mean to the point where if it was raining, we used to get into the REP and go park over by, because we knew, and it didn't disappoint. I mean, I remember one night we had a pin job where the car went into the zoo. And we're in the zoo now. He took down a fence and everything. So like, get the zoo people over here. I was like, are we in an enclosure? Like, what are we in? Like, what's the deal here? Because we didn't know what was going to pop up. I mean, one of the worst pins I ever had. I would put this in the top 5. One Friday evening at like 6:30 in the evening, some kids joyriding, roll their car, pin themselves, and the freaking driver, you knew he was a driver because his car was on its roof. The windshield is out. His hand is pinned under the steering wheel with his arm broken to the ground. And 3 truck came over and helped us. We were there for a good 45 minutes before we got them go all out. You learn there was an emergency cop, Mike McGuire, who went on. He became a sergeant. You're taught how to use the Hearst tool in certain ways. There's a procedure. There's a procedure to lift the dashboard up where you wrap a chain around the steering wheel. You got to wrap it to the front bumper. It's the official way to do it. It takes time. One night I had a car into the back of a tractor trailer on the Deacon. Both legs of this guy are broken. And he's pinned under the dash. So here I am getting chains. Mike, who was in ESU about a year before me, says, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to move the dash. He goes, no. He goes, there's another way. And I was like, okay, here, you take the tool. And I learned it from him and passed it on and used it ever since. Like if you shove the jaws all the way up under the dash, you literally can lift the whole dash up in one shot. And I was like, that's the whole thing about ESU. You come in to learn, you pass it on, you teach people. And, I always said this about ESU is, some people like, can anyone be an ESU cop? And my answer to that was, if you want to be, you can be. Like, if you have no desire to do the ESU work, which some of it was dirty work, I was like, no. But I said, if you want to be here, I says, you can learn anything you want here. There's no shame in, not knowing something. I mean, one of the things that comes up is one night we came back for a tour. We see the 5-2 sergeant. He's like, oh, you guys weren't working last night. I said, no, we were off. He goes, I could have used you guys. What happened? So we had an accident. We had an overturned vehicle. And I asked the ESU guys to upright the vehicle. And they said, we don't do that. And I went, who the hell told you that? We found out who it was. I'm not going to say their names. They were newer guys. So we go, why didn't you upright the vehicle? They're like, oh, we don't know how to do that. I go, you didn't get that in STS. And, it's possible you could have been out that day, or had something to do. But long story short, the way it worked back then, what we did is, we told them, well, your tour ends at midnight. Well, you're going to spend an hour here on your own time. So what we did was, those were the days when there were abandoned cars all over the Bronx. 1 o'clock in the morning, we took them over to Sedgwick Avenue, found a couple of abandoned cars, purposely rolled them on their side and on their roof, and then told them, okay, upright the car, and showed them how. And they're like, oh, we didn't realize it. I was like, you should have asked someone. Like, you can't not do what you're called on to do. And I said, every truck worked differently. In Ford Truck, we tried to be welcoming. And in my whole time in Ford Truck, if I ran across 3 guys and that whole time who, didn't want to listen, that's a lot. Everyone that came, the guys that came with the merges, the guys that came with the different class, I said to everyone, listen, you went to STS, you have a base. I says, now it's going to continue it. And I said, Ford Truck, we used to call ourselves the training truck because we had not a constant, but every couple of years we'd have transfers because they would send people to us who lived in the South who'd stay with us for a year or 2, but then they wanted to go to one of the Southern trucks, obviously, to avoid the toll. But there was a period where we laughed. We had, except for 5 truck, there were people in every truck in the city that started out in 4 truck. It was a matter of pride for us because when we came in first, we were the newest kids on the block, and there were other trucks that thought we were going to screw something up. They thought we'd screw up a job. They thought we, we didn't, because when it opened, you had people like me who were just there, but we came in with people that had a couple of years in the issue. I'm trying to think. I think the most senior person that came there was someone that had a few years. And then as time went on, more and more people transferred in, and, great group of people. The original crew of people there. My old partner, Dennis Kaczynski, who passed away, unfortunately, after he retired. Dennis is the reason I went to Midnights. I did the scooter chart first, and I went to Midnights in '91 and never left them until I wound up leaving to drive Steve Bonanno as the CO in '02 or whatever it was. But Dennis and I had an absolute blast on the Midnights. I mean, when I tell you, you name it, other than maybe, a job where King Kong was involved, we had it, perp jobs, gun jobs, pin jobs galore, people in the water, and you learn so much so fast. Like I bought a pin alley before. One night we just started our tour and they called us for a pin. I didn't send you these pictures, but it was Chinese New Year's, and some guys were out celebrating it, and they came into that turn too fast, driving a Toyota Supra, and Supras have the alloy wheels. And when they came around, they hit guardrail, cracked the wheel drags, the gas tank drags. Long story short, the car burst into flame, all 4 of them, burnt to a crisp in the car. And we wound up having to get them out. We didn't get them out until like 3 o'clock in the morning. And one of the things about pins, car fires is, once a car catches fire, it changes the composition of metal. Like a Hirsch tool on a regular car, whether it's the jaws or the cutters, will slice through that car like butter, like a hot knife through butter. If you set that car on fire and change the composition of the metal becomes stronger. So instead of that smooth cut, you get these snaps, like these violent snaps when you cut them. So, you learn all these things there. I mean, again, like I said, I know you've talked about, you've talked to guys about the fire department. And, I had a couple of capers here and there with them that I didn't particularly care for. I never, looked at, as at the police department, ESU is, us against them in the sense of, they had their job and we had our job, and ESU has been around since 1930. And, I know from research and other things, that the fire department didn't want anything to do with what they call non-fire emergencies, until fires slowed down. And, I mean, most of my dealings with them were pretty good. I had a couple that I could think of that, I always say to people, if it didn't happen to me, I wouldn't believe it, because I was like, it's just so crazy. Like, I wouldn't expect this from these guys. And I'm not knocking the fire department. I don't have anything against the fire department. And it wasn't the fire department as a whole. What they had over us was, unlike the police department, the fire department backs their people up 100% right or wrong. They just do. And the
Right, within reason.
NYPD does nothing of the kind. And,
Mhm.
you know, the NYPD sometimes doesn't back you up when you're right, which is, you know, very difficult to deal with. I mean, one of my first issues I had with them was at a pin job on 161 in Mars one night, 11:30. You know, it was a pin job. We get there first, working on the door, and I needed a light because my flashlight died before we had decent lights. And, you know, fire company shows up, and lieutenant goes, you guys need anything? I said, you got a light? So he's like, yeah. He was trying to be slick. He was like, okay, get out of the way so we can. What do you mean get out of the way? I just asked you for a light. So, get out of the way. I was like, what do you mean get out of the way? Like, I have a hearse tool in operation. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it's our
Long
job.
story short, the guy shoves me like a good shove, which I'll be honest with you, I'm not the type of cop you want to shove. I never was. And I was so shocked that this man shoved me. Like, I'm not talking about a tap. I shoved him back and asked him, like, you know, what the hell's the matter with you? And, you know, there was a bit of a little scuffle. And I'm like, is this what goes on here? Like, this is crazy. So, you know, that happens, you know, move on from it. You know, you deal with that. I had another caper on the Deacon one night. Get a pin job that wasn't. We roll up. The fire department is in front of us. They're pulling up with us, weaving through traffic. So they stop. So I'm driving the REP. So I go around where the REP is because I see the car. I'm going to shove the car off to the side. And I don't skin them. I'm like, I make a, you know, good wave around them. We go, getting ready to move the car. All of a sudden, the fireman steps up. And I used to be amazed at this stuff because I'm like, their bosses are standing there watching. It used to piss me off. And this fireman says, he's got an axe in his hand. I didn't think anything of it. And he says, oh, you almost ran me over when I was getting off the rig. I go, what do you mean I almost ran you over? What are you talking about? So, you know, we have a couple of words back and forth. Nothing bad, no cursing or anything. I just said, you know, wasn't anywhere near you. So he tells me, he's adamant that I almost ran him over. So now I'm like, in my head, I'm like, what is this like? Is this like, are you guys looking to cause problems? And I say this only because these incidents are not, you don't see this in the newspaper. And it always bugged me that the police department always caught the black eye for this stuff. And any cop knew that the police department did not want a black eye no matter what.
No,
and this guy with his axe at one point raises his axe. And this, like I said, if I weren't there and having this happen to me, I wouldn't believe it. Raises his axe and does like one. And I go, what? Like, what's the matter with you? Now, if you don't know me, you don't know me. But I don't get flustered. Like, I wasn't going to duck. So I'm like, what are you doing? So I said to him, listen, just get back on your rig. I said, I don't know what you're doing. And he still got his axe up. And I go, what are you going to do with the axe? And I said to him, I said, you can't possibly be that crazy. And, you know, he winds up leaving. Now, he leaves, I leave. I don't think anything of it. About a week and a half later, I get a phone call from work. Yeah, the CO wants to see you. He's going to come up. Okay. I'm not going to even say who the CO is. He comes up, starts asking me and my partner, did you guys have a job on the Deegan with some firemen? And he starts describing his job. And I go, yeah. He goes, oh, would you guys almost run over firemen? This is the commanding officer of our unit. It's not someone who'd been in the issue. And I'm like, Inspector, like, of course not. So I tell him what happened. He goes, well, I heard. And in my head, I'm like, where did you hear this from? Now, I can't really ask him this because he's the CO. I come to find out his neighbor was a battalion chief who was told this story, mentioned it to him, and without even like asking us what your story is, here's our CO who assumes we've done something wrong. So that's kind of what you ran up against sometime, you know. And I'm sitting there like, Jesus Christ, like we literally do. I said, we don't come out here to cause problems because we know we're not going to get the backing from it. And you know, I had another incident where a fire lieutenant, I'm not going to get into all the particulars of it, you know, like
yeah, I mean, listen, small sample size, unfortunately.
well,
You know.
well, I say this only because and you know, I only mention these incidents. I know there weren't a lot more because the opposite side. I'm assuming this was just the individuals. The opposite side of that is, you know, one night there was a pin job on 161 by Park at like 4 o'clock in the morning. A van's on its side. A guy's half in, half out. The fire department pulled up before us. The guy has a tool out. He's getting ready to work it. I kind of suggested, that wasn't a good spot for it. He kind of ignored me. I was like, okay, you guys are here first. You're doing it. So he lifts the van up and the van shifts, kind of like recrushing the guy. Mm-hmm. So I tell him, stop. So his lieutenant, I give his lieutenant credit. His lieutenant goes, you know how to get this guy out of here? And I'm like, yeah. So we show him. We actually used their tool and our tool. And it was all about positioning. Got the van up, got the guy out. And the lieutenant, I give the man credit. Big professional, very professional. I used to see him time after that. And that's why I say that, because it wasn't all negativity. It's just that from the police side, if you got into an incident with the fire department that made the news, you were in some kind of trouble. There was no even if you could be 110% right, you were going to catch flack from it. Even like, you go to 9/11. 9/11, one of the on top of everything, one of the things about 9/11 that infuriated me was, for the longest, you had some retired guys claiming the police department, and they blamed aviation, knew these buildings were going to collapse and, ordered their people out and didn't tell us. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Like, I was there, heard all the trend, like no such thing happened, but this is the story that's put out in the press. And my thing, I say this to people, listen, the NYPD isn't perfect. I didn't join the NYPD because I had to. I didn't join it to impress anybody. I enjoyed myself. I was very proud of being a cop, love being a cop. I can criticize it, but I'll defend it when they're right. And, like I said, you tried to avoid, most of the dealings with them really weren't a problem. You just would have these problems from time to time, but when they would come up, they'd be like, the potential to be really, really ugly, and right. You had to avoid them. But, in Ford Truck, another thing of, the small world thing, I think a couple of pictures I sent you, there's a couple of pictures of me standing on a foot post somewhere. And one is me and one's another cop. And the guy that took that picture is a guy that used to take pictures on the concourse in 188 for years. An unassuming freaking, street vendor. And he used to take pictures of people on Saturday nights. You'd be a big movie theater there. And that guy one night, Teddy Wright was an ESU cop. Teddy was in ESU before I was there. But then he left and then he came back. So when he came back, he comes to Ford Truck. And his first night back, he's working at midnight. So I'm talking to him, just, saying, it's pretty good over here, blah, blah, blah. I chat with him, I leave. I wake up the next day to this big news story about a shooting, cop killed in the 4-6 precinct. And I'm reading it, and there was a robbery. The 5-2 got involved, car chase, shots fired all around the 4-6, up around the concourse. Unfortunately, that night, someone who I'd known and seen for years, a housing cop, was killed, Gary Pico. He was killed in an R&P accident with an ambulance up on, I think it was 176 and the concourse. And I knew Gary Pico for years. He was taller than me. Very nice guy. And
Steve Lanos worked with him, actually.
Yeah, very, very nice guy. And come to find out that the main instigator was the guy that took those pictures. The unassuming guy that every cop had seen up there for years, that night showed his bad side. And, like I said, he got into a shootout with the 5-2. He was chased until he crashed, got out and ran. I was like, Jesus Christ, that guy? So this is the thing of, you never know who's who, unless you really know somebody.
Right.
But that was Teddy Wright's first night back. And I was like, Jesus Christ. But, the thing about ESU that I liked also was, the fact that you got involved in everything. You went all over the place. There's a lot of tragedies involved. There was a cop called, what's his name? Forster?
Neil Forster.
Neil.
Yeah, he got ran over. He died a year later. For the audience, I could just let me just give the audience context real quick. Neil was, I think, doing duty on traffic one night, December of '96, and a drunk driver who was an off-duty officer ran him over. Neil suffered a lot. You can look it up for about a year. He died December of 1997 as a result of his injuries. But yeah, that was he was only 30 years old. Very tragic
Well,
story.
that night we had just got back to quarters. It was around 4 a.m. and we're in quarters getting ready to eat. And, you know, you heard the sirens outside. I'm like, what does 50 have? We switch on to the 50 and all you hear is screaming for a bus, screaming for ESU. So we run downstairs, roll up there before EMS. She was right on the Deegan, just north of Van Cortlandt. And I get there, you know, carnage, you know, there's cars, but here's this cop, uniform cop on the ground, his legs just about amputated. And he's like out of it. So, you know, start working on him, looking for a bus. We get the medics there, you know, we help package him up, get him to the hospital. And I was like, you know, I don't know. So at that time, I was like, you know, I don't know if he's going to have his leg. And I was like, I don't know if he's going to survive. And he wound up dying. You know, like you said, a year later, he was in rehab the whole time. Like you said, talk about suffering. And then that was one I had, you know, where a cop was obviously critically injured. I think it was the third squad that had Judice or Gadis, who was the cop that got killed in the 5-0 with the broken glass from the table, which you wouldn't expect. And I think I remember Bobby Steinman telling me like they couldn't stop the bleeding. You know, I call that cop luck, you know, where you could shoot a bad guy 10 times in the legs, he's fine. You shoot a cop once in the leg and it hits the main artery and he dies, you know. And, you know, again, like I said, you know, I mean, it's part of being an ESU. You have to be able to process all this stuff and keep rolling. And I mean, I think all the stuff I went through, I hate to say it, but, you know, I mean, I'll end my talk with, you know, really talking about 9/11. I think everything that I went through in, you know, before ESU, in ESU, in Ford Truck, I kid you not when I tell you, I think it all played a part in not dying on 9/11, you know. And on 9/11, you know, we lost 14 guys. And I tell this to everyone that I talked about 9/11. If ESU wasn't ESU, if we didn't have the bosses we had, that day ESU probably would have lost 50 or 60 guys. And I say this because, I mean, Sergeant Sullivan from Six Truck. Last time I saw him was a year ago. Every time I see him, I hug him. And him and John Coughlin, Sergeant Coughlin, who died, those two individuals saved my life that day. Me and other cops. Coughlin was U4 that day. When 9/11 occurred, I was on the vehicle committee, so I was always doing vehicle stuff. And Coughlin was U4 that day, which was unusual, you know, but he was U4. So I was downstairs getting ready to get on my motorcycle and go to CRS with some papers for a truck. And when the first building was hit, a portable came over SOD and said he'd think a plane hit the building. Everyone's assuming, oh, it must be a Cessna. Like, it can't be anything else. Within a minute, the transmissions pick up. So I watch Coughlin, the third squad, Steinman, Schwerner, Driscoll, Franco Baraducci, Joe McCormick. I watch all these guys roll out of Ford Truck quarters. Everybody's heading down there. So I'm still on the phone. I'm still going to head to CRS. So when the transmissions pick up, I start hearing one truck. I go upstairs. We had a TV upstairs, and I look, and as soon as I see the smoke, I'm like, that's not a Cessna. Like how the hell did a jetliner hit this building? 9/11 was a beautiful sunny day. Long story short, the only two people left in quarters was me and Danny Guiney. Danny passed away, I think, a couple of years ago. And we started getting back into uniform. And the only vehicle left was our ESV with the airbag and the Stanley tool on it. So we started getting back into uniform. The desk calls, you know, hold the midnight. I'm like, the midnight's gone. It's just us. We load up some extra gear. We started heading downtown. Just as we crossed from the Bronx into Manhattan, literally on the bridge, the second plane hit. And we look at each other like, oh, my God, this is a terrorist attack. So, we get down there. I park on West Street. And, you're there at this horrific scene, you know. There's a picture from down there that shows the back of 3 REPs. And I laughed. Those are 4 truck REPs. That was the Adam car, the boy car, and the truck. And the Adam car, John McClure, my partner, we picked up the night before. It was a brand new car that had to get some work. So we just loaded it up. And a beam came down, crushed the cab of it, set it on fire. We were like, okay. And, I'm down there and I'm talking to Coughlin. Coughlin's U4. I get him on the radio. And, when you're on the direct, you said names. I was like, hey, Sergeant, need anything? He's like, no, Tony. He goes, we're good. I think he said he was up around the 20th, 25th floor. And, it takes a while. I know Franco was talking about it takes a while to get up there. You just don't walk in there. And I said, you need anybody? We got some bodies out here. And I give him credit because he was like, nah. He goes, it's thinning out. We're not seeing a lot of people. And we're just going to continue working our way up. If he had said, oh, yeah, I need some more teams, myself, Guiney, and who knows else would have gone into the South Tower, St. Good Rodney. That was the first building that fell. And, when the second plane obviously hit, Sullivan showed up and he's downstairs. And I think it was a truck, big truck was there. And the one piece of equipment we didn't bring with us was our heavy vest because when we left quarters, we thought it was an accident. We didn't think it was a terrorist attack. So Sullivan tells a bunch of us, listen, we know this is a terrorist attack. He goes, I'd like some guys in heavy vests and with long guns because we don't know what's coming or if there's another component to this. And that's a simple order. That's not anything complicated. That's not like something you had to sit and plan. That decision that he made saved a life. Like I was always pissed. I mentioned to people, I was like, that man deserves some type of recognition, some type of medal, something for that. Because I said, from the guys that I was there with, that would have been another 10 guys in these things. And, it was a pretty calm day as far as continuing what was going on the ESU side. You had Winkler, who was like our command post, more or less. I heard him on the radio and other guys on the radio, and we were stationed around the building. We're on all four sides of it. And, I always said to people, other than the actual collapse that killed so many people and killed our guys, the worst part of the day was watching people jump out the window. Because when you got down there, John, what a shame. But, there was all kinds of debris floating in the air. And, you would hear the impact of people because the impact of someone jumping, sounds like a bomb going off. And, you'd be looking up at these buildings. And they were so tall, you would not notice it was a person until they were around the 50th floor. Like people were jumping from the 70th floor, 80th floor from the heat and smoke. And the only way you could pick out there were people was the debris was fluttering. The people had a straight trajectory. And, as they got closer, you could clearly see it was a person, and I never went to actually physically go look. I mean, one of the memories from that day is 3 people. Obviously no way, I've never known who. 2 men and a woman. The woman had a skirt on, and the 3 of them, wherever they jumped out from, they were holding hands. But the force of the wind caused them to break apart. So you had these 3 people coming down at one. I mean, I watched this standing on West Street, and they broke apart. And obviously, you hear the 3 impacts. That I've always said this to people who have short memories. Who, they're like, oh, that was a long time ago. And I was like, if you were there, you could see all the people. And keep in mind, I'm watching 2 sides of this building, 2 sides of one building. I don't see what's going on the other 2 sides, which is the same thing, or from the other building. And I said, if you could see people forced to jump out of a freaking building to their sure deaths, it's not something you would, get over or forget. And, I was never a glory seeker. I don't need medals or anything like that. But, that day, I'm sure on all sides, people made all kinds of decisions that, were routine decisions. When I was standing there, a Port Authority rescue truck pulls up. Now, this is their property, their deal. And I forget who the cop was. And he says to me, he goes, where do you think I should park this? He's in his big rescue truck. And he goes, I'm thinking of going in there. And I called it the chute, that spot south of the overpass. And I said to him, listen, that's my truck. I said, I wouldn't go in there. I said, it's packed in there, and I just don't like the way it looks. So he looks at me, and he goes, you know what? Okay. So he made a right, and he parks. I'm like, okay. A couple minutes later, Brooklyn South Task Force pulls up. The lieutenant's in the lead car, and he's got a caravan of radio cars and vans full of cops behind him. And he pulls up, and I just happen to be standing there. And he says to me, "Oh, Brooklyn South Task Force, where can we park these caravan?" So I look at him, I'm like, "Where do you want to park?" And he says, "Well, I'm trying to get in there." He wanted to go, so he was, and I said, "Lou," I said, "it's your choice." I says, "I would not go in there." I said, "I don't like the way it looks. I just wouldn't go in there." I says, I just sent the Port Authority car. And I give him credit because, if you would have caught an arrogant boss who would have been like, "Oh, well, I want to park there, I'm parking there." And he goes, "Okay, emergency, if that's what you say." And he went straight. 10 minutes later, where his caravan, that Port Authority truck, was buried from the South Tower falling.
Oh, wow.
And I say about my experience because, if this would have been, I was at the 93 inside, wasn't there I showed up later on that night, but you try to park as close as possible in case you got to get equipment and stuff like that. And I don't know what it was about pulling up that day. I had no inkling the building was going to fall, but from the minute I got there, I had an uneasy feeling, which, to be honest with you, I've never had in my entire career in the issue. Never in my entire career did I ever go to anything and feel uneasy about it, and I did. And never, I think, oh, Jesus Christ, I can't think of his name now, from Three Truck, who used to be an iron worker, who, from what I've told, oh, Jesus Christ, somebody remembers his name. He wore glasses. He did the equipment truck after a while. Because they were saying that he was saying from the time they saw the buildings in Brooklyn, the buildings are going to fall. And that was because he was an iron worker before he was a cop. And I had no inkling the buildings. I had no freaking idea. It was the last thing on my mind. And when that South Tower fell, I was standing on West Street. All of a sudden, you heard. Some people like to say it was an explosion. It wasn't an explosion. What you heard was the sound of steel snapping. It's just a loud, distinct sound. And it was so loud, like an idiot, I decided to walk up to it, like, "Oh, what the hell is that?" And I'm walking towards the building when, if you ever see, there's a famous picture of the South Tower coming down where you see a huge chunk of the building sideways.
Yeah, I think the guy that took that picture was, and I think this is correct, Kevin Barry from the Bomb Squad. It may have been him.
Well, I was standing down below with a bunch of other people, and it's funny because I heard the noise and I couldn't see the tower yet. And just when I start seeing it, I see that and I'm like, "Oh my God, Doug." I thought the top of the building was going to fall. I didn't think the whole thing was going to fall. And I'm sure you've heard it from other people. The sound of both of those buildings falling was like the loudest freight train you'd ever want to hear in your life, and it never stopped. Because when I realized the whole building's coming, I turn around now to run north with other people, and I'm running, and I've described this to my kids, and I was like, it's like a horror movie. Because Mark Ripple, that is correct, John. That's right, Mark Ripple. Mark Ripple used to be an iron worker, and Mark, apparently, from what I understand, when he was in Brooklyn, as soon as he saw it, he was like, "Those buildings are not going to stand." Of course, nobody expected these things to fall, but there was an architect who apparently was in one of the buildings, and apparently he knew the sway was too much, and he realized I think he tried to get to one of the command posts or something to say, "Listen, these buildings are not going to stay up."
He did. He got to the FD command post. So Dan Nigro told the story. He goes up to the FDNY command post and he says to Pete Gansey and Deputy Commissioner Fee, Pete Gansey was the FDNY chief of department, and neither of those guys made it that day. He says, "Chief, these buildings are going to come down." And Commissioner Nigro, who at that time I think was Chief Gansey's number 2, or Chief Gansey's aide rather, they all turn around and Chief Gansey says, "Well, who the F said that?" And it's the architect, and the architect starts explaining these buildings are not gonna last, and so they start kind of augmenting their game plan. But they stayed at the command post. Nigro, of those 3 guys from the FDNY that were at that command post, rather, excuse me, Nigro's the only one that made it out. Chief Gansey and Chief Fian both perished.
Yeah, that's that South Tower. And like I said, I never dawned on me a piece of the building would fall. I didn't have a good enough eyeball on anything to make that decision. So like I said, when it started to fall and I realized it was coming down, I turn around now to run, not like a full run. I'm kind of jogging. And if you ever seen, I can't remember the movie, it's a horror movie where there's like a fog coming at you. Well, when this building started hitting the ground, you felt it in the ground, but all of a sudden this rolling dust cloud was coming at you. But it was coming at you in slow motion, but coming. So I'm looking back and I'm running. I have people running past me, and I remember female cop, short black female cop, don't know who she was. She's running and she sees me and she grabs me, and I tell her, stop running. Because I knew this cloud. I kept looking back. It was getting closer and closer. I'm a big guy. When this cloud finally hit me, the concussion coming out of it almost knocked me over. But I didn't get knocked over, and this female cop is screaming, and I cover my mouth up, and I tell her, stop screaming, cover your mouth. And I mean, the horror of that is you went from bright sunlight to you could not see your hand in front of your face for about 10 minutes until the dust started clearing. And wound up going into a school, and it's ironic because I'm a news junkie. So here I am in this school now. I'm covered in dust. My eyes are covered in dust. I'm looking for water to get my eyes clean. Me, Ronnie Griffith, Danny, we're all in there. And there's a news reporter in front of me, and I know him. Byron Pitts is his name. He's with ABC. He was at CBS. And he says, officer, he goes, I'm on the phone with Dan Rather. And Dan Rather, and I'm like, Dan Rather? And I'm like, I watched Dan Rather, and I'm like, I don't have time to do any interviews. And he goes like, well, he just wants, I said, I don't have time. So I got water, get it cleaned out. We wanted to go back out. So I laughed because him and a couple other people were like, you guys aren't going back out there, are you? And we're like, of course we are. We have no choice. By the time we started going out, you had guys from one truck calling for help because Mark, why can't I think of his last name now? A couple of guys needed help getting off of some obstruction. I think the third squad, Bobby, Joe McCormick, Evan Schwerner, these guys were all like caught up in some debris up against the tower, and then the order was given to evacuate the North Tower. And I tell my kids this, I think about my grandkids, and I'll tell you, that was a day I might never have met them, because when the South Tower came down, we made a decision, okay, we're going to have to send more guys in. And it was myself, Guiney, Griffith, a couple guys from A-Truck. We grabbed tools and we're all walking into the North Tower when it starts coming down. I don't know if you're familiar with the old Trade Center. Like, you see the buildings, but to get to the lobby, you have to go up these big marble
Right.
stairs.
There was a concourse that was above street level.
Yes.
An escalator took you up there.
So we're walking up that, and we're all about to walk into this building when what you heard was, I call it the freight train started. And it's funny because I found out later on, Billy Bury, I think about Billy made it out, but he was traumatized because right behind him was Vigiano, and I forget who else. Like,
it was John Delera. It was John Delera, Mike Curtin, and Claude Richards from the Bomb Squad. Those
and
guys. These
guys, like, the first tower, I'll be honest with you, I didn't think was going to do me. And the second one I did because of where we were. And, at some point you look up, we're trying to get down the steps. And I remember seeing the damn antenna, which, you think to yourself, and I'm thinking, oh, well, and, we got away from it. And then, the rest of the day was, it was a nightmare, trying to, account for our guys. Like, we thought the whole third squad, we called the third herd from Fort Truck, was dead because we couldn't raise them. And we found them later on. I remember there's a bunch of us in an auditorium. They walk in, everybody was like, oh my God, we thought you guys were dead. And I remember driving around later on, and actually Glenn O'Donnell pointed out, we drove past it 3 times. He goes, oh, look. We look, and there's the landing gear from one of the aircraft on some street down there. And I look and I go, oh my God, that's a friggin' airplane tire, just sitting on the street. And then we were down there I was down there till 4 o'clock in the morning when Scotty Strauss and the rest of the guys were trying to get the Port Authority cops out. That were
John Bushing was there.
And, I spent, I spent months. I think I stayed down there until the last day. I've actually not been back to the World Trade Center. I walked out of there, that pit, on the last day. I didn't stay for the ceremony. I've literally never gone back down there. I was going to go once. I wanted to go with my kids, but, the people that were running it had this no gun policy. I called them anti-gun liberals. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. The cops that were down here that day, that almost died down here that day, they can't come here. I was like, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. And I was like, I'm absolutely not going down there. I mean, not only the what occurred that day, but I mean, I was down there along, obviously, with other guys for the recovery of some of our cops, some ESU cops. I was down there when was it Claude.
Claude Richards, yep, from the bomb
There was a
squad.
cop. I'm not going to say who it was because I don't want to, if he ever hears this, his family to be traumatized. I remember being down there one Friday night into Saturday, and just before we're about to leave Saturday morning, the excavator uncovered a poor cop's body. The body looked like ground beef. And this is a couple months after the 9/11, and way we knew who it was, because even though his body was destroyed, he still had his uniform on, shield was still there. And this is why I say, like, I'm one of those people, like, I'm like, like if I live to be 100 years old, I can never forget that day. It was just a terrible, terrible day. And it's a shame so many people, don't quite understand what transpired. And I'm talking about the rescuers, the 300 and some odd 343 firemen. I was like, what about all the civilians that died that day? People mind their own business. And some people don't understand this. I don't know if you knew this. The 93 attack that only killed 6 people. Do you know what the objective was that day?
Well, the objective when they parked the truck bomb, because there is a specific reason why they put that truck bomb there in the parking garage, is it was supposed to go next to the support beams. And if they did their job correctly, which thankfully that day they didn't, it was supposed to topple the north tower into the south tower and
Right.
send both towers falling down into the street.
And do you know how many people that would have killed? A lot of people, I was talking to someone about it. Each tower, when it was full of people, held about 25,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so you're telling me these people are looking to kill 25, 35, 45,000 people? And this country still didn't wake up and realize, okay, these people are serious. And it was just, I think there was a car in the way or something where they couldn't get that truck bomb.
They couldn't get that truck there. Well, here's why they didn't take them seriously. And this has been analyzed a bunch of times, and I've talked about it with quite a few of the bomb squad guys. They took them seriously, but the guys one of the guys at least made the mistake of going back for his deposit on the van. So they thought, these guys, they can't, they're the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And some of them were. But Ramzi Youssef, who was the lead architect of that bomb, that was a real terrorist. And I'm not complimenting him in any way, but he was evil personified. He knew what he was doing. The clowns he was with didn't. Different story. He knew what he was doing. And 8 years later, the job that he couldn't finish was unfortunately finished by his comrades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll tell you, like I said, just a terrible, terrible day. I remember talking to Tina Guerrero about that day. I think my memory serves me. I think it was around the time she had her second son. And, again, like I said, I mean, the thing about ESU was at that time, I think we were about 400 people. Like everyone in ESU knew everyone. Right. And of the 14 guys that got killed that day, the only cop I had never worked with was Tolte. Every other cop I'd worked with, Santos Valentin, was trained in 4 truck before he went to 7 truck. And every other copter I knew, Jerry Dominguez was a Highway 1 cop. I knew him since he was a Highway 1 cop before he came to ESU. I remember when he was talking about coming in. And, Rodney, I mean, I knew Rodney from the time he came in, before he was a boss, after he was a boss. Like he worked in 4 truck for a while when he came back as a sergeant. And, I'll tell you, it's most people in most careers other than, cops, firemen, soldiers, don't go through it where nobody thinks when you go to work, the people you work with or some of the people you work with aren't coming back home, and they'll be gone, and it's just a terrible, terrible, terrible time, and, I mean, I can't say anything good came out. The only thing was the department finally, I guess, gave ESU its props, after 9/11 went down, they started handing out shields, which they never did, which used to amaze me. Like I got a shield. I was in the first group. I think I had 15 years in ESU, and it used to kill me. I could have had a shield years before. One of the things I didn't talk about is I was involved when Nelson Mandela came in the parade. I drove his bulletproof truck. I actually helped with the construction of that thing. And CRS, I was assigned to the chief. Oh yeah, the parade. Yeah, that's me driving that truck. Was assigned to the chief department's office for a couple of weeks. So that's a NYPD CRS built vehicle. It was
it looks
bulletproof
like it.
glass. We had a conventional AC in there, and again, like I said, you had your great moments, you had your sad moments, and like I said, I have nothing bad to say about ESU. I mean, I don't know how ESU is now in the sense of, I think somewhere along the line when they came out with this whole Sims things, I think when Bruno was the commissioner of OEM, they screwed ESU. I mean, that's the fault of the police department, and when I first got into ESU, I think I was 2 years into ESU. I wrote a article for a magazine. I went to get it printed. I sent it to Police Magazine, and they made me laugh because they sent it back. They go, "This is a really great article, but it's not the kind of article we write. It's too fact-based." So they sent me to another publication. I have it downstairs that printed it. And it's funny because the article I wrote was basically an article that says the NYPD ESU is like the most efficient tactical rescue police unit in the country and probably the world. And that's how I felt back then. And I mean, I feel that way even more now. Like a lot of people talk about LA SWAT, which is a great unit, but they basically just do tactical work. The North Hollywood shootout, when that occurred, there was a cop in SWAT that I used to talk to about vehicles. They had the Bearcats before we did. So I talked to him. So one day he brought up that shooting. I said, "Yeah, we all saw that. That was something." And I was like, and he made me laugh. He was like, "How would you guys have handled that?" And I go, "Well, if that happened here, what happened with you guys never would have happened." He was like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The first REP that got there would have ended that job." And he was like, "What do you mean?" ESU, when I came into ESU, we only carried 2 shotguns in the REPs. We'd wanted to, and then they finally added a rifle into the REP. And they added, you had the shotgun, but you had the rifle. You had a Mini 14, which the Mini 14 is an old gun, but it was an effective gun, very easy to shoot. And I told him, I said, the first REP that gotten up would have been able to put rounds through those guys' armor. I said, you never would have had the hours-long shootout you guys did. Like, we spoke about different things. Like I said to him, like, I don't understand how you guys work out of one spot in a city like LA. I've never been to LA, but while we have almost 3 times the population of LA is, I think, 2 to 3 times the size of us. So it's spread out more. And I was like, I don't understand how you guys don't have like 2 locations at a minimum. But there's other departments, I kept up on all of this stuff. Detroit is one of those departments. Like if there's a SWAT call, like everyone goes back to the base before they go to the job, and growing up, not knowing any better, I thought ESU was something that all big departments had, and I was shocked to discover they don't. I through some research by chance, and I've never been able to get, like, I'm sure the people who are involved in it are dead now, but the only other big city police department in this country that had an emergency was the Atlanta PD. Mm-hmm. They dropped it in the 70s during that recession and let the fire department do everything. And I found that out reading an article about the Atlanta Fire Department. And I don't understand. I mean, I think the formula for ESU is just such a great formula, and in a department like New York City, serving New York, that's such a big city, I mean, there's so many components. Like I say this about the NYPD, that it's such a great job because I always say to people, I don't think you quite understand what goes on in the city unless you're involved in this. And I mean, even not ESU, like one of the things I always loved in NYPD was some of the detectives, and I'm not talking about like the detectives in narcotics, or I'm talking about the actual squad detectives, who they're the people that may move on to a sex crimes or something. They're people where you're like, God forbid, if something ever happened to someone in my family, I want him or her on the case because just how good they are. And actually all of that comes from being a good street cop, Yeah. And like I said, it's I have no complaints about my career. My only thing I wish I'd done differently was I wish I'd realized I should have become a boss. I said, other than that, I can't complain, and even I mean, I'm proud of it, but my son's on the job. My son's been on the job for about 14 years. He's on a promotion list, and right now both my daughters are in the academy.
Oh, there you go.
One's getting out soon, and the other one's and I was the first cop in my family. But Like I said, times are different. Rough times now to be a cop. The people in charge running the show are so anti-police. It's terrible. Absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. But
What I
anyway.
will, it's been a great show. What I will say is a couple notes that we can end on. One is facetious, and that is Patty Pogan previously held the record for longest interview in the history of this podcast. He was at 3 hours, 12 minutes, and 1 second. You've passed him. We're currently at 3 hours, 13 minutes, and 40 seconds.
Listen,
43 seconds
there's
counting.
Tons of stuff I didn't even bring up. I didn't even get into the vehicles and all that other stuff.
You can come back for a part 2.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2 one of these days.
Yeah, I got some open slots.
I've never told my 9/11 story publicly. I was supposed to put it into that archives they did, and I never did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not one of these people. I wouldn't consider myself traumatized by. You talk about it with amongst the people that were there,
right?
But
it helps.
Like I said, it's. I look back on, like I said, I lived my dream. I grew up most of my childhood wanting to be a cop. I wanted to be an NYPD cop, an ESU cop, and I achieved it. And I have no complaints. I have no complaints. It's
you shouldn't. It was a heck of a career, and you got a lot to be proud of. Listen, as you said tonight, there was story, and even from the time in New York City EMS and some of the stories you were telling there in Mount Vernon, it was a full plate in all aspects. You got to experience different things, and obviously the crowning point, the icing on the cake, if you will, was those almost 20 years in the emergency service unit. The other note that I wanted to end on, this is a more serious one, but us talking about the events of 9/11, how it impacted ESU, allowed me to remember this. So thank you for that. I'm going to share the screen. This is, of course, Sergeant Mike Curtin. And of course, you work with Mike Curtin. The reason why I'm sharing the screen for Sergeant Curtin tonight is because it was this day, March 6, 2002, that Sergeant Curtin was recovered from the Trade Center. And that story I've shared before.
I was there for his recovery.
Yep. As of course, his wife Helga was too. That night, they found him in the general vicinity where 6 World Trade Center was. And Sergeant Curtin was last heard from there. He was, like I said earlier, he was with John DeLara. He was with Detective Claude Richards from the bomb squad. And they had gone into 6 World Trade Center with a few other guys, Dan McNally from the bomb squad, Billy Berry, Steve Belay, I think, was there too, and a few police officers from the Port Authority Police Emergency Service Unit, just to do a sweep of that lobby and make sure nobody else was in there when the second collapse occurred. And unfortunately, Sergeant Curtin, Officer DeLara, and Detective Richards were killed. Barry Galfano, who was also not with us anymore, died of 9/11 cancer, played a central role in the reason why Mike was recovered this day 22 years ago, because for the audience, if you don't know this, they traced back the radio transmissions where guys were last heard from. And they traced Sergeant Curtin's transmissions to 6 World Trade, and they knew it was Sergeant Curtin because at the time he was carrying an MP5 because he didn't know what was going to happen next. He still had his MP5 on him when he was found. So I wanted to take a second to acknowledge him and everybody from ESU.
Yeah, I remember Kelly came down for his recovery. I know they flew his wife, and aviation went and picked her up. And
Kelly, also former Marine. Sergeant Curtin was a gunny sergeant in the Marine Corps. So this was, it was his day 22 years ago, March 6, 2002. But this has been a pleasure. I thank you very much. We will definitely do a part 2. Stick around. We'll talk off air briefly. I'd like to thank everybody that tuned in tonight for supporting this episode and continuing to support this show. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven Podcast and FDNY show, he worked in Squad 61, the Special Operations Squad, and Squad 41 as well, both in the Bronx, North Bronx, and South Bronx, kind of like what you did with 3 and 4 truck. He also worked in Rescue 4 in Queens, and that's going to be Lieutenant Mike Roy for Volume 55 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Tony. Like I said, stick around. Thank you to everybody in the audience tonight. And on behalf of Tony Johnson and Mike Colón, it's been Volume 43 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. We'll see you next time. And as the E-Men like to say, anytime, baby, take care. Have a good night, and we'll see you again Friday night.